Pero no soy yo, es la imagen. ¿Listo? Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días. Les
Hello,
damos la
good morning, everyone. We welcome you to this panel of lack of equalities. And it's the matrix is the lack of local equity in America. And this is hosted by the Social Security authorities of the Inter-American Conference. The floor is going to be open for the General Secretariat, Álvaro Berlanga Hernandez, who's now connected. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you're all having a great day. And I want to profit this opportunity to greet you all and to welcome you. I salute you on behalf of the president of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security, Soes Robledo Aburto. And I'm going to take the opportunity to celebrate this opening forum. This conference is about social security and Afro-descendant communities. And it's a pleasure for me because these type of events or conferences are the places in which the Inter-American Conference on Social Security Studies visualize and analyze the lack of fairness, the discrimination that Afro-descendants suffer in the American hemisphere, specifically in the Andes region. So in these panels, we want to highlight and understand the general law acts, the provisions that guarantee the rights of these populations. And as I've said, it's an honor because that's what this is about. We want to be capable of visualizing the problems, the obstacles that are the consequences of segmentation and discrimination that's seen historically in our nations. So, even though I mean, this has happened for so many, many years, and it's always a challenge. So we have to take steps forward to face the challenges. And by visualizing it all, then we can tackle the challenge. But I acknowledge Edu and I acknowledge the vice presidents of the Inter-American Conference of Social Security. Thank you for that major effort of hosting and coordinating this event. I don't want to consume much of the time we have today for the panel, so the floor is going to be open for our official hosts and Cristel specifically. And I want to thank all of you. It's a beautiful place. I'm streaming from a Mexico venue that's called Ciudadela, the Citadel in Mexico. I'll invite you to visit this historic site or national heritage site in which we have many of the historical findings of this nation. But thank you. Great success for all of you. We thank the General Secretary for opening the panel and for welcoming us all. Now the floor is open for Mr. Salvatore San Pietro, who is here representing the Social Security authorities in Peru. And he's representing Cristel Quiros, who was not capable of joining this panel today. Thank you very much, dearest panel members, members of the conference. It's an honor for me to open and celebrate the opening of Social Security affairs and Social Security matters for Afro descendants. This is a panel for mindfulness in which we coordinate the seven Andes regions with other stakeholders, in which we celebrate in the Andes the Afro descendant communities. We celebrated on the 31st of August. We protect human rights of Afro descendants. Today's activities will lead us to discuss the challenges that we're facing, the lack of fairness and discrimination, the lack of the principle of equity in Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, we're densely populated by Afro descendants in the CARICOM community, and there's been historically colonialism that have really left its scars behind, along with migration and displacements of different communities that have made the demographics really migrate. And there's a lot of separatism and hate speech, and this perpetuates a state of lack of equality, which obstaculizes the eradication of poverty. We want our citizenships to be socially healthy and under the model of democracy. Afro-descendant communities have been affected by the structural discrimination So in our countries, we have to narrow the gaps in face and protect human rights for employment, social security, and the gaps are always growing. There's a lack of equality in our societies that's interlinked with other ways of discrimination based on gender discrimination, age discrimination, which generates a lot of injustice with our community. So we have to take on action with a strong decision. We are not here to lament the past, as the General Secretary said. We're here to analyze, what hinders and to submit proposals to achieve narrowing those gaps. We have 6 panels with many activists and government officials of different institutions that would help us to understand which resources that are available, as well as, the social security benefits that are going to be matter of discussion. You know, there's a lot of there's lack of equality in LATAM, and we will thoroughly analyze the factors that lead us to face discrimination and social inequality in LATAM. Specifically, we're going to be analyzing the Sub-Andes region. We're analyze the thorough structure of what triggers lack of equality in the region. There's a lot of priorities in our list to defend the rights of Afro-descendants. We're going to analyze the achievements to protect our people's rights. This type of panels really lead us to discuss and centralize on building the principle of fairness and other fundamental rights for Afro descendants. So all the dialogue that's part of the sequence of conferences should lead us forward to build fairer communities that include everyone and protect the communities. This is part of a sequence of panels that lead us to strengthen social security for Afro descendants. So I thank you for joining this streaming and thank you for following. We thank the Inter-Immigrant Conference for its hard work, and we thank you for being completely engaged as activists fighting for equality. Thank you very much, Dr. San Pietro, for your words. As you've mentioned, as well as our General Secretary said prior, this panel is going to focus its dialogue on the Sub-Andes region. It's part of a major effort of the sequence of conferences so we can discuss at this table and debate what has to be done for the 5 sub-regions. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for us to have the representatives of the Social Security authorities of Peru. They have the vice presidency of this authority or body. They're also coordinating the Sub-Andes region. So we acknowledge the VP's efforts for materializing this special sequence of conference with the General Secretariat of the Inter-American Conference. Now the floor is open for the sub lead of strategies, Brandon Perez Gonzalez, who I acknowledge for organizing the panel along with his staff. So he will introduce the panel and the panel members. I thank you, and I'm Maria Teresa Gonzalez. I hope you enjoy this great event. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this streaming. Before we begin, I would like to remind all the attendees that you can listen to the translation in English, Portuguese, and Spanish via Zoom, as well as through all the digital content channels or means. You can select the language of your preference by clicking at the toolbar in Zoom, the language that you prefer. So, as I've said, and the General Counsel said, and the Secretariat said, and the coordinators of the Sub-Andes region, we start this sequence of panels about social security in Afro-descendant communities. These panels are part of an initiative that we've built to protect the Sub-Andes regions, which are constituted by Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. So this is why we've hosted this panel to speak about specific themes, starting with this panel. Throughout the panel, we're going to have the opportunity to discuss the socio-demographic complexities that the Caribbean and Latam face. We are robust, we're rich, and we have been affected by colonial activities throughout our history. And it's part of the analysis also of the migration flows, and there's a lot of hate crime xenophobic activities that perpetuate the lack of equality in a region. We're affected in different areas. We have not been able to eradicate poverty. We want to have a government under a democratic model and protection of human rights. In this panel, we have to analyze the factors of the that lead us to have a lack of equality and discrimination in Latam. We are going to analyze the structural axes in a matrix of content in which we will see how our demographic samples have grown and what's the impact of on Afro descendants throughout the decades. We're going to see the scope of rights and the impact of violation of rights in health, education, citizen participation of Afro descendants. We're going to integrate all the challenges to understand what Afro descendant communities face when trying to have access to social security benefits. We have experts at the panel, examiners that will share their vision and experiences in such relevant topics. So we hope that this panel leads us to be very mindful, to have some food for thought, to take cases of reference so we can build a stronger society. I'll introduce the first panel member. Thank you for joining this link. I will speak about David Alejandro Gomez Arriaga, director of the Afro-American Center of Studies called Tembembe. He's a proud Afro-descendant, Afro-Mexican, and he's defended and built his community in Morelos. He has a political impact, and it has been really important at a local, international, and scale. He has a clear ethnic perspective. David has fostered different educational initiatives, so there's a greater understanding of Afro descendants in Mexico. He has played a crucial role in different political studies, supporting youth plans, acknowledging their active participation, and he's part of the spotlight. Thank you, David Alejandro, for being part of this sequence of panels. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take the floor, and I thank you for presenting me before of our audience. So I know it's hard to believe that we've achieved so much, but it is what it is. During this sequence for this morning, I'm here to talk to you about the situation that we're facing in Mexican context. We have found great opportunities. We're trying to generate a strong dialogue and trying to foster and protect Afro-descendant communities' rights specifically because we have the establishment, right? We have in the establishment, we have been capable to obtain statistic data. It's been a cumbersome effort to obtain the statistics. I don't know if somebody can share my slideshow with my presentations or the stats so I can continue my. Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Well, basically, in this slide, you have an analysis of the national Mexican norms and the statistics to try to solve all the challenges that we're facing as Afro-descendant communities. I think this is shared and this has been compiled at a regional scale. I'll focus my dialogue with you along with the slide to share what's happening in Mexico. Statistic data underrepresent or don't have the clear statistics. You know, I want to give you a number. We have indicators constituted by stats. And in Mexico, with these stats or indicators, we can visualize the landscape that's object of criticism because we're living in this community as Afro descendants. Back in the census of 2020, we quantified the Afro descendant population that lives in Mexico. Around 2% of people in our communities are Afro descendants. It's almost 2.5 million people. However, the government states that these numbers are not, I mean, this is the most recent data. So we rolled out a survey to measure the demographics, and the stats lead us to understand that the numbers could increase. It's an extra 1.3 million people in that quantification. If we had that population census, we quantified in our demographics, we know that there's people that acknowledge themselves as Afro descendants. So people who answer the questions answer that they're Afro descendants, but if they're having another baby or the child that's about to be born, if they don't satisfy the characteristics of their demographics, it's like they're quantified or not. We have the National Mexican Female Institute, in which 74.8% of women that consider themselves Afro descendants in Mexico are affiliated to some social security institute or body in the country. That percentage is pretty high, but it's a mismatch with reality. You know, we have the media in the country, and those numbers are not realistic or reliable because we are analyzing in the direct communities. So these are parameters that lead us to really try to understand the numbers that lead us to certain conflict at state level. And we're activists, and as activists we're working in analyzing the process. We see the numbers that don't match or square off with reality. What we've witnessed, you know, let's go to the next slide, please. Could somebody help me share the next slide? You know, we've obtained those numbers, and the data is there. We have other anecdotes in certain reports that we have compiled thanks to our communities. When we exercise our duty seriously to really observe the life conditions, the living conditions of Afro descendant communities in Mexico, we realize that the problems that these communities are facing, they're very harsh. We compare reality to the statistics. The numbers are not like realistic. We're underrepresented. So the quantification of our people do not match or square off with the numbers which are a reality, with what we observe in real and you know live in what Afro descendants are facing here. But I'll just give you a tangible example of reference. In the Pacific coast of Mexico, one of the greatest cause of kids' deaths are just like if they're bitten by a scorpion. I mean, it's like they can't have like an ambulance take them to a hospital. There's only one hospital in a coastline that will take you 2.5 hours to get to the hospital under an emergency situation, and we don't have the antidote available. So the official government statistics are there, and they tell us, the numbers tell us that 80% of Afro descendants have access to the public healthcare systems. But in reality, as a matter of fact, Afro descendants like me don't have access to the healthcare systems. And if we analyze the dynamism in our communities, what favors us? We don't see what favors us. So there's a mismatch with the numbers. There's an underrepresentation with the stats. And there's three problems that are very tough that we've detected. In Mexico, Afro descendants in our societies during the colonialism were part of a very caste. It's like a system did not enable us to acknowledge, you know, our societies and communities and even grow economically as Afro descendants in the social hierarchy. And I say this in quote unquote. So that hierarchy and caste in Mexico makes it very difficult for many communities to distance themselves from the classist public trends of social security and laws. Jose Maria Morelos was an Afro descendant politician in Mexico that started the Mexicans' independence in a book that was written, Sentimientos de la Nación, or The Feelings of the Nation, after the abolition of slavery in Mexico. He decided to ask to submit a petition for the abolition of castes or that hierarchies. So think about that system. In the case, we acknowledge the indigenous populations in Mexico, our communities, they're barely implementing amendments to really have that self-awareness of indigenous communities in Mexico. So language language was crucial for us to achieve this, but there's many institutions that still don't acknowledge Afro-descendant communities, and they think that if they do acknowledge, they're going to fall back to the caste systems. They acknowledge Afro-descendants, they acknowledge the indigenous populations and mestizos or mixed race. It's very tough for some stakeholders in society to try to fall back to history and acknowledge the ethnic differences. And some simply deny that. We have to start the change by educating ourselves. In Mexico, in education, we don't have in the systems of education the historical data of Afro descendants in Mexico. In our history books, we don't know that there were Afro descendants that really structured this nation. So that leads Afro-descendant kids and youth to be underrepresented in education, and we're not open to dialogue, trying to reach equalitarian stances in Mexico. It's common for Afro-descendant communities to be. We're a minority percentage-wise. For example, in Mexico City, you might find three, four kids that are of Afro descent in a school, in a classroom, but we're not correctly represented ethnically nor culturally. So some people don't understand even what Afro descendant means. You know, it might sound ridiculous, but it happens. For example, in the state of Morelos, during the colonialism in 1785, they had almost in the population an 80% of Afro descendants living in those cities. And when there is the process of independence, the Afro descendants were simply eliminated or erased from the historical books. So acknowledging Afro descendants in the state entity of Morelos is very important. Only 3% of the population in Morelos acknowledge themselves as Afro descendants. From a 70% of acknowledgement of Afro descent, there's only a 3%, and there's no demographic explanation for that. Afro descendants simply stopped accepting that they're Afro descendants, and we don't have a communication strategy or campaign to communicate what Afro descendant communities are, and they're strong. People are still discriminated. Afro descendant or being Black of origin is something that leads to discrimination, and people that are biracial. I'm a son of a Black man, even though the tone of my skin is not Black, I still suffer systematic violence. First of all, because of the denial of identity. When we speak about our African or Black blood directly. So, could we go to the next slide, please? This slide, you can have a visual of a lot of data compiled. We don't have a digital version of this slide. Those are two pictures that were taken from the National Institute of Indigenous Population during the 8th and 9th of August. That's when we celebrate indigenous population in Mexico and in this National Assembly. So there's only these two pages. In the only channel, like chapter where we're going to see Afro descendants being mentioned is in one bullet point in which we have a catalog for Afro descendant rights. At state level, the authorities don't acknowledge the existence of Afro descendants as a minority or a group that has rights. So the acknowledgement of the additional layer of Afro-descendant rights are not in the wording so we can defend our population. Next slide, please. This is the definition of the national Mexican norm, the standard. It's just a segment, just for information. Mexican norm, in its wording, refers to technical laws and regulations, provisions that we can enforce when there's service or a task to achieve, or regulations that are used for people whose health is at risk or in danger. So we have communities that are protected by this norm for food safety purposes. This norm regulates healthcare services or other services that are offered. Next slide, please. Next slide. In this norm, I'm going to analyze briefly the initiative of the law. That's the 20th law that was published on the 18th of July. That's for healthcare systems. So we established this frame to have, healthcare services during pregnancy for women, etc. Next slide. In this next slide, there's a chapter or a paragraph about the terms and definitions about acknowledging ancestral medicine or Afro-descendant medicines as as part of traditional ancestral medication. Mexico is strong in its indigenous communities, so by default there's gaps in the law. So there's the Afro communities. Health practices, the cosmovision of our communities, and the traditions and medicine and the tradition. So there's no federal acknowledgement for Afro descendants in that sense. But at least in this paragraph of this Mexican norm, we do have the record of the fact that midwives or midwifery can be Afro-descendant in origin, and that they have this cosmovision and customary tools that are used in Mexico in traditional practices. This opens the threshold to narrow the gaps and tackle the loopholes in the Mexican laws. We have it here because there's traditional practices by Afro descendants in Mexico. Till this law, we did not have any acknowledgement. So, with this law initiative that's been passed, we have that threshold or door open. Next slide. It's very important to pinpoint that as part of this draft of law, the wording in our law leads us to really regulate and understand the basic needs of a person. If a person is acknowledged as a traditional midwife, and the classifications of the traditional practices of medicines, we correlate it to Afro descendants in this nation. It mandates the state to ensure that there's intercultural mechanisms or tools for people who are professionals to exercise traditional ancestral medicine and midwifery, opening up for free practice of these disciplines, which will benefit Afro descendant communities so we can all fight systematic discrimination, opening that door in the healthcare system for these practices which are traditional. In this healthcare system, there's no acknowledgement of Afro descendant practices. Traditional medication. We've been systematically discriminated in these sectors. And last, the healthcare system acknowledges in this chapter the traditional medicine, which is essential for customary reasons of the Mexican indigenous communities and Afro descendant communities. So, in the wording of this law, we have to draft. A stronger law or frame at state level and allocate the correct budget. When we add the chapter of essentials, we have to allocate a share of the budget through the National Institute of Indigenous Populations and through the healthcare system in Mexico so that budget can be taken to exercise or use to protect Afro descendants in our communities. Next slide. And in this chapter, you can see that I pinpoint the other three norms that are object of our analysis to see the chapters of traditional medicines and Afro descendant and customary practices in this nation. In this project that was submitted to draft the norm, we have the minimum frame. We need specific infrastructure for ancestral medicines. We have to create another prenatal unit to fight sexually transmitted diseases. And there's another norm in which we have the chapter of fights against violence. And you see, there's a historic debt. We are in debt with Afro descendant communities and indigenous communities in this country. Next slide, please. Here, in the official norms, the spirit of the norm, and you see it there, it's in chapter 11.21. We have this chapter of prevention of STDs or sexually transmitted diseases. And in that chapter, we can add, for example, the constructs midwives, physicians, doctors, traditional practitioners of medicine. We can classify the types and obtain statistics based on the national statistics centers. We can even measure the conditions that we suffer and as a community, and we can draft our own material to obtain valid data and collect this data so we can really understand the level of violence that our people are living, even in the prenatal obstetrics unit and in the field of STDs. There's so much to work on. our people in our communities can be affected by sexually transmitted diseases. So we have to build programs to prevent and treat our people. We have the other chapter of violence exercised against women. So we're fighting violence against people that are even, objects of violence when pregnant. And pardon, we have a specific protocol to protect women who are suffering violence while pregnant and we're not just protecting women, we're trying to protect all our kids, our youth. We're trying to develop protection shelters for women, shelters for women who are subject of violence. So these centers have been built to protect them. Not only that, there's first tier, second tier attention and services, there's psychological help, therapy, and we're trying to build a strong community of women who had fled violence. It's very important because this is the first time a door by through law has been opened to protect these communities, and we've obtained hard data, statistics, so we can translate that into a clear understanding about the level of violence. So we face reality, we're familiarized with that reality, we live this. It's a day-to-day activity. In our case, I've 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 been a professor in Afro communities. And it's clear to us that the mother and the child are suffering violence at the household. How can we determine that they're suffering this? We can have their testimonials, anecdotes, but how do we communicate this with the state? When we enforce the Mexican norms, we open the door for opportunity. Next slide, please. So we open the door for that opportunity to work with immediate action and to plan things out with our programs to really protect. These are practitioners of traditional medicine, midwives, and other disciplines. So, with this discipline and with this frame, we can find that protection of law. And we must enact the law to protect Afro descendants. It has to be enforced. This is created for the protection of Afro descendants, traditional Mexican practitioners, midwives, and others. So there's a lot of work to do, and we have to be capable of obtaining data to see what our traditional medicine practitioners, midwives, and others are having to deal with so we can strengthen the capacities that our traditional medical practitioners have to go through. We've gathered this information, firsthand information from Afro-descendant communities. So it's necessary to tackle the challenges that we're facing, and the government has to be on board and engaged. We have to obtain qualitative and quantitative data because historically, Mexican state denies the data that's obtained, even through stats or the population census. Back in 2015, we quantified the population and we determined that there were over 100,000 people of Afro descent in a state entity of Mexico. And the response of the Mexican apparatus was that it was unbiased, or that there was a skewed. And, if we ask someone in the population of the demographics, if they're Afro descendant, they might just answer back when questioned that they're Mexican. They wanted to see only Afro descendants in the coastlines, not in Mexico City. And there are a lot of Afro descendants detected in Mexico City. They were simply not acknowledged. The government apparatus denied the numbers about the census of the population. I mean, we see the population census that dates back to 2020 and tally that, compare it to 2015. We have to constantly monitor and work in vigilance to really acknowledge the numbers. And the Afro-descendant communities were moving forward, but the lack of acknowledgement from the apparatus and the denial of it really gave us a setback. Before the United Nations and the Permanent Forum of United Nations, we created and had a seat. We drafted a project, we have the general frame, and we were there trying to clearly build a strong mechanisms of law, and we're dedicating our efforts to to work together through the government apparatus to achieve more. I mean, we're lacking budget. We know that we don't have the infrastructure to provide clear data that could be used later on. So that's why we need to obtain clear objective data to measure what's happening with Afro-descendant communities in Mexico. With the creation of this Mexican norm, we open the door for opportunities. In fact, you know, the Colombian midwives achieved their projection in that country. They found the opportunity. The midwives in their communities in Colombia, the midwives took the statistics, checked the birth rates of their communities, acknowledged then by the government of their country. Now it's our opportunity. Now it's our time. I think that we have to organize ourselves with institutions, with international mechanisms and tools to really be capable of collaborating with this joint initiative to protect the Afro communities. And pardon, I don't know if I'm out of time. I haven't been given an instruction. And I'm sorry if I spoke too fast or if I rushed through my participation, but I'm open and ready to receive all your observations and your feedbacks or any question for that purpose. And I'm very thankful for your full attention. And I pardon for speaking so fast, but I had so much to say. And I know that I have little time, and I know in this panel, we're here to collaborate and to be active. And thank you for opening the floor, and thank you all for your full attention. Thank you very much, David. I had the opportunity to talk to you, but the attendees that are following our streaming, you know, we spoke about Afro-descendant communities and social security, state-of-the-art tools. And David, you're just very important for all these projects. Thank you for enabling us to call other panel members. Thank you for sharing the hard work we've had to compile. Thank you for driving the initiatives in this conference forward with your project. So it's the first time we speak about Afro descendants and social security. Thank you for leading us to analyze the lack of equity or fairness. And we know that there's stats, but it have enabled us in Mexico to measure the number of members in our communities. Thank you, David, for staying in this panel. Then we're going to have a Q&A. Now, Carlos Alvarez will take the floor. Carlos Alvarez is an expert in sociology, a human rights activist. He's an educator, Afro-descendant activist known for his fight and struggle against discrimination in Argentina and Latam. He was born in Uruguay. He obtained his Argentinian citizenship. He's been an activist fighting for injustice that the LGBTQ plus communities and the Afro-descendant communities are facing. He was part of a collegiate body of Afro descendants that fought for human rights and equal opportunities in Argentina, fighting for ethnic equality. He launched the first plan to protect the Afro descendant communities in Argentina. Now he is leading the national program in his country, fighting for the rights of Afro descendants, and he expects to be part of the a permanent chair in the United Nations, fighting constantly for Afro descendant communities globally. Carlos, thank you for joining us. I know Carlos is traveling to another affair. He's taking an international flight somewhere. Thank you, Carlos, for joining this panel. One second, please give me a moment because I'm on the move as we speak. And give me a couple of seconds. I apologize. Don't worry about that. You know, I was waiting for David Alejandro to finish his participation. I just had to move a bit. So, who will take the floor after me? Marta Rangel is next. Would it be okay, pardon, if we can change my participation with Marta Rangel's participation? I apologize. Thank you for that flexibility. Don't worry. As I've told our attendees, we know that you're traveling, going abroad. So, in that sense, I'll present our next panel member. Thank you so much for being with us, Marta. She's one of the authors. She's been a great writer of papers at ECLAT. She's been working in the projects in this initiative that are state of the art. So, Marta Rangel, consultant of the Economic Agency for LATAM's development. She's an economist expert in the field. She's generated many executive reports about Afro-descendant communities and has drafted and recommended policies. She has many methods that are also using indicators trying to incorporate gender and community information. She's a facilitator in different workshops about gender and ethnic Afro-descendant training programs there. Thank you, Marta Raquel, so much. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for opening the floor. I'm very happy and honored to be here as part of the panel. I was asked to share my presentation with diagnostic data or observations about my understanding of what's happening in LATAM. I'll base my communication with you on this full report or executive report that I have at hand. It was a paper that was drafted at ECLAT. It was published a couple of years ago. We analyzed the Afro-descendant communities in LATAM, in all the CARICOM communities, and we've obtained data that have sufficient data was part of the compilation to create mature indexes or indicators. We analyze the lack of equality and we analyze specific themes at the kickoff of the studies. So we analyze the culture of privilege that leaves the Afro-descendant communities out and a lack of equality in in our nation. So I'll share my presentation now. Thank you. Where is it? It's here. Can you see my slides? Can you see? Yes. So you see my slideshow. I was given 12 minutes to open to this dialogue. I don't know if I'll consume more time. I summarized my information as much as I could, but there, I mean, in this study, we analyze the lack of equality in Latin America. We have the laws and regulations, the institutional frames, the institutions that are part of this effort to try to fight lack of equality that affects our samples of our demographics. So you have this slideshow, and in my slide, we have the enforced policies, the provisions that impact Latin America to overcome the situation of discrimination here. This is part of the legacy. We see the Afro descendants exclusion historically here in the slide. Let me we're in that fight. We're in the Afro descendant resistance and fight. We are part of the public agenda. It's not something these compilation of data is sourced thanks to a lot of struggle, many fights. We have all fought through slavery. We have abolished that, and we understand the position that we were out. So, after a lot of struggle and many fights, we finally achieved some progress. I loved what David Alejandro said. So, he's a great Mexican representative of what's happened. So, I see that in Mexico, there's a lot of progress in recent times to protect the Afro descendant communities. Prior to these efforts and the population census, the development was little to none. And so after 2015 and 2020 in Mexico, they quantified their Afro-descendant communities, and now we're sensitive enough to work intensely. But as I've said, this is the source. This is a consequence of a struggle. In Latin America, we have instruments, we have international conventions and treaties, we have sub-regional treaties that make reference to the Afro-descendant populations. They in Latin American countries, in the majority, have acknowledged Afro-descendant communities. We measured what the numbers of over 20 economies or nations to measure the ratio. Martha, we were still analyzing the first slide of your slideshow, ma'am, but I don't know if you can flick it forward. We're only seeing the initial slide of all your information, ma'am. So I'm in this other slide now. Ma'am, I don't know if you want to share your full screen so we can have like a clear visual of the content of your reports. One moment. Could you tell me where I can share my full screen? I can't find the button, the icon at the bottom. Click on the toolbar. Okay. Thank you. As I was telling you, the main instruments, the main international instruments, sub-regional instruments, the national and all of these instruments have been ratified. You know, their constitutions or the charters of the Latin American countries, I don't know if there's 12 or 14, more than 10 countries acknowledge in the charter or the constitutions that there's Afro-descendants. And there's a specific provision in Afro-descendants. There's acknowledgement in Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico. And only three countries, including Mexico, have in their constitution reference of the Afro-descendant people. And others, so there's other chapters in which there's data about Afro descendants, and there's 16 countries in which there's the general acts against discrimination due to race, and it's typified as a crime. Not in all the countries, you know, there's a lot of progress in Brazil and Colombia. There's a lot of acknowledgement of there's acknowledgement in Brazil, and we have created robust chapters in our law, and there's many progress in the past administrations in Brazil and other economies. So we acknowledge, and there's progress. So Brazil has progressed a lot, but you know, we think about the territory, the acceptance, and the territorial spread of the communities and the allocation of land for different Afro communities. So we have to pay close attention and study these laws. So let me change the slide. Okay, ready. In this slide, I have a graph that shows you all how there's 14 Latin American countries that have government mechanisms at national level to work and foster and build social equality, racial equality. Uh, Prior to Durban, Durban dates back to 2001. I mean, it built the capacity of the institution in countries. So there was conference in Nicaragua, and in Nicaragua they had that Durban conference constituted. And prior to Durban, we had to measure what happened in these 14 countries that have it all as part of their backbone. You see the data? Let me see if I can increase the size of the screen. I don't know if you can see the full screen. It's really something that you can't visualize my screen. We see the PowerPoint toolbar, but it's you're not sharing your full screen, ma'am. But if it's not too troublesome, I could keep my slideshow like that. I unless I'll click the button and it's not working. So you see the progress in the graph. In the efforts to include the term Afro-descendant in our laws, as David said, you know, the lack of acknowledgement of Afro-descendants is something that impacts our youth, our kids. And we're working to try to attribute or impute the responsibility. If the father of a household is Afro descendant, the children born in that household are considered Afro descendants. I don't know how it works in Mexico, but the lineage is something that we analyze, and I don't know how it works in Mexico, but we have to understand the nation's reality. The census back in 1980, there were two countries that participated to measure their populations. if it was first Brazil and Cuba, and the census in different economies started at Brazil and Colombia in 1990. And the population census or quantification, we see 9 countries in 2010, 11 countries in 2020. We expected, or we had 18 countries. 18 countries do acknowledge the term Afro-descendants. There are some countries like that were a bit behind, but Paraguay and others have included the concept of Afro descendants in Mexico. Argentina, in their laws, have included the construct of Afro descendants in their country. We have in the list of countries Haiti. Which other countries are we missing in the list? I, so in the last forecast of ECLAT, we estimated that by 2022, the Afro-descendant population represented a 23.7% of the Latin American population out of 153.7 million of total population. So the population in its demographics was heterogeneous. You see the numbers in 1895% of the Haiti population are Afro descendants. Brazil 56%, Cuba 36%, Dominican Republic 34%, Panama 32%. So we had the census in Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, and you see the percentages of the quantification of the demographics. And it was like a 3%, 7%, and that 9%. But that's part of our reality. And you see in the last census of the population, we obtained these numbers. Colombia, Costa Rica, Peru, Ecuador have in their populations throughout the census a 7 or 9%. Rest of the countries are or the Afro descendants are measured as an 5% of their population. Venezuela has a low percentage in their population census. According to the measurements, we have the ACLAT data, and the census dates back to 2022. Venezuela has 3.4 in population, and you see in Mexico 2.5 million. So now, so I can show you what lack of equality is. I selected 6 indicators to measure the lack of equality: poverty, lack of infrastructure, drinking water, healthcare during pregnancy, D, education, and E, labor market, and F, violence. And so that's something that's obtained through Latin American numbers. And how can we compare or contrast? In the field of education, it's like education levels that are considered the minimum levels of education. The labor market, at least in the data that we've obtained, we see that who has a job opportunity, or are there's many people that have jobs, but there's some that are in different fields. I know that I have a short period of time, but there's also objects of our analysis like the wage gap, the wage differences, between race, and then there's violence exercise in the graph. Let me know if I'm talking too fast for the sake of time. Just let me know. And poverty in letter A, poverty is very severe in Afro descendants, and the gaps are so strong in our countries. We try to measure the level of poverty. The graph is what I've obtained from the official website of ACLAT. And we measured what happened in 6 countries. The data is from 2021. So the severity of poverty is there measured. In Panama, in the graph, you can see that the severity of poverty is less. But you see the gaps are very high in Uruguay. And you see poverty is correlated to the percentages there, and it's triple fold, or it multiplies by 3 uh, in comparison. But if we obtain the data, and in the national surveys, we measure that poverty is double or triple. In Brazil, there's many Afro descendants that suffer poverty in comparison to people that are from a different descent. But This is the letter B, it's infrastructure and drinking water. You see the graphs throughout the years. In the last census of population and infrastructure, we see the Brazilian context, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay. You see the graphs, you know, the access to infrastructure in different and drinking water, the difference is the lack of fairness or equality is measured there for Afro descendants or Uruguayans who are of African descent. They have less access, as the graph communicates. In Colombia and Ecuador, Afro descendants suffer the access to drinking water. And there's a lot of Colombians in the population that don't have access to drinking water even. So we measure the total. And in Ecuador, Afro descendants in the country do not have drinking water. If we go to letter C and healthcare and maternity and teenage maternity or it's you see maternity during teenagehood is something that's measured and spread in the population. So it's teen or early pregnancy is detected, and there's hard numbers because the less the level of education, the higher level of poverty, is extremely likely for this segment of the population to well be pregnant in teenage years. So there's many teenagers that are of Afro descent who are pregnant. So you see the percentages, 19 or 25% or 15%. If you compare that number, to Afro descendant girls and girls that are not of Afro descent in Ecuador, you see the numbers. If you're not Afro descendant, there's a 10% or 15% of teenage pregnancy. You see the immense gaps in these countries in comparison to Venezuela. Girls who are teenage mothers end up facing other difficulties. They don't have access to school, to education, to good job opportunities. So you see that affects and leads to severe poverty. And education, letter D, we've compiled the indicators and we see the minimum thresholds of education that our youth should obtain to have a decent job. And I consider, by ILO or other agencies, we've obtained these numbers. So people who are 25 or 29, and if they well achieved elementary, middle school, and higher educations, they could have access to jobs. So you measure the Afro descendants who have access to education. So the numbers are 2.5%. And in Colombia, you can multiply that times two. In Ecuador, 50% of people who are not Afro descendant finished high school, middle school, and these other levels of education in comparison to Afro descendants. And in Peru, 70%. You see, so the gaps in Peru are very strong. So the gaps are higher in all of these categories or postgrad or higher education studies, as you can analyze. In Brazil, we enforced with affirmative action and with a law the capacities or the effort to narrow the gaps. In letter E, in the labor force and market and equal pay, you see the payment per hour, depending on school years. We measured what happened in almost 20 countries. We have the census of the population and the wage gaps. So this is a rolled out survey, and we went knocking to households to see what was happening in Peru and Uruguay and all these economies. So per hour, the Afro-descendant males received $13.3 per hour, and Afro-descendant women or not, I mean, males who are not Afro-descendant receive $13.3, and Afro-descendant women only get paid $8.0. So we measured. So the people obtain double the amount of wage. So you see the gaps, which are very deep, and are very clear and detailed in the graph. You know, there's many years in this study that was rolled out. You see the gaps. You know, the gap when the people are 0 to 5 years, the gap is almost unperceivable. But person that's not of Afro descent earns 3, $4, and there's a white income and the narrowing of the gaps. When the gap increases, it's correlated. There's a correlation to education and income. You know, there's people that have studied over 13 years. They spent over 13 years in their schooling, but the gap is still strong. You know, the greater the studies, the gaps go greater or grow greater in income. We have other indicators in letter F of violence. In Brazil, you know, in Brazil, they have their violence census or statistics measured. So we unbundle and spread or break down the information per age group. Then there's this age group breakout due to race and age and education. This survey in Brazil dates back to that time, and we've measured the violence which affects the young population. If I take the General Executive Report of 2020, we can visualize the reality. So here, what I want to highlight is the fact that in Brazil, you know, our youth are being killed and affected by violence. You see the graphs. You see the white population of Brazil in comparison to Afro descendants. And in this graph, we haven't considered the indigenous population, but Afro descendant populations in Brazil are more than half. So you see the lack of equality and the death rate in Brazil. Over almost 4 point or almost 5,000 people or young Afro descendants were killed, and by dial no, it was the number is 5,000 of non-Afro descendants, and you see the males and female death rates in this country: 22,136 people in the population die. So every few minutes, a young Afro descendant male in Brazil dies or is murdered. So with this slide, I'm about to wrap up with my participation, but pardon, Martha, I just want to comment. I think we've run out of time. We've exhausted our 15 minutes. No problem. I will give you the general detail, but in these many countries, they're drafting policies and general acts to narrow the gap so we can achieve development plans. We're trying to consolidate our efforts in different economies. We have general protection acts and laws to avoid racism. We want to strengthen the traditional communities. And as I've said before, we want the Afro-descendant communities to participate. With affirmative action. We can tackle or narrow the gaps in the field of education and the labor market. We want to narrow the gaps. And the last slide, as a conclusion, what would we observe? The the separation due to race affects and violates human rights of the population, generating lack of equality, specifically affecting the Afro descendants impacted with a lack of job opportunities and lacking access to education and suffering racism. So we have to fight the lack of equality. We have to take immediate affirmative action and create the government mechanisms to open a dialogue and to visualize what's happening, creating the programs for Afro descendants to participate, going through the analysis of our statistics, which we can use and finally work under the model of democracy to preserve the system strategically, because the territory where Afro descendants live are territories where we're trying to preserve. And here we have the list of books of reference listed there. As I've told you, there's a list of books there that I used as reference for this report. Thank you very much, Martha. Your information has been very interesting. I know that our time is our worst enemy, but with your slideshow, we can see how we all correlate. The violation of rights due to one situation or the other was clear and evident in your slideshow. Now, Carlos Alvarez, would you like us to uh, share your presentation, sir, so you can take the floor? Sir, we can't hear you. Sorry about that, but let's give our panel member a minute so we can have an open mic there. Can you hear me? Yes, sir, loud and clear. Okay, perfect then. I've had some technical difficulties. You know, sir, we're losing the connection. Pardon. It's my connection to internet. First of all, it's an honor for us. Pardon. I don't know if you can hear me loud and clear. If not, I'll try to connect using another landline. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for the invite. I thank the Inter-American Conference for having invited me. For us, it's an honor to be taking the floor with valuable panel members such as David, this major activist, and we're thankful for Marta Rangel's participation. She's dedicated her studies to Afro-descendant studies. Pardon, I connected using a second device just because it was necessary. But to begin with, I want to explain what's happening with our situation in Argentina, which is clearly complex. If we speak about the fact that Argentina historically has proven that it's a white European country in origin, like Mexico and Chile, these countries have denied historically the African descendants' existence, denying national identity, denying Afro descendants' participation to build a state. Afro descendants and Latins in Afro descent have then taken the stance and become activists, kicking off a process to be visible. There's a lot of racism that's denied the presence and participation of Afro Argentinians and Afro descendants when we try to build national identity. As Marta said, we're in this fight for equality. We've moved many projects forward in Argentina, fighting for Afro-descendant rights. And there's the principles and the pillars we were discussing in the third World Conference in the fight for xenophobia, racism, and lack of tolerance in Durban. That instrument of Durban that dates back to 2001, that's the Afro American or the Afro descendants movement. This builds strength. It's fundamental. It's the bedrock. Why? Because in countries like Argentina, they're trying to like think in Argentina that everything that's of African descent is bad, that it's negative. And Argentina exercises racism in our country every day from the root. Every single day in Argentina, where Blacks or Afro descendants, pardon, we're not visible in this country. And being of African descent is correlated to negativity. Being an Afro descendant is correlated to the negativity, to poverty. So the Afro Argentinian movement starts, and it kicked off, first of all, by acknowledging our Afro American or Afro descent. There's a lot of fights and struggles of international scale. We've been trying to work and implement or enforce the Durban instrument. And we're here in accompaniment to give back our rights and rebuild based on the United Nations instruments and protocols. There, we celebrate the Day of Afro Descendants, the International Day of Afro Descendants, the first decade of the acknowledgement of justice and development for Afro descendants. So it's been a struggle. So we had to go through all that for, to exist. Afro-Argentinians and Afro-Argentinian culture is celebrated on November 8th. Miss del Valle, who was a Afro-descendant activist in Argentina who fought the hegemony and discrimination. You know, there was a census in Argentina that dates back to 2010, and the population census or quantification was executed in 2022 amidst the pandemic. So Afro descendants in Argentina were included. In 2010, we were quantified. At least 105,000 people acknowledged their African descent. So it's a percentage in our population, and there's 40 million in population. And by 2022, in the population census, we measured or quantified at least 300,000 people that acknowledge themselves as Afro descendants. And then there's a 0.5% of the population in correlation to the millions. If we quantify the demographics and we multiplied our numbers in population times two, we know that of Afro descent, there's around more than 2 million in population. There's underrepresentation through the quantification of the census in the population. So I have this book, Census Identity, Afro Descendants. I don't know if you can see it clearly because I think with a camera, it's not taking it clearly. I'll share this report with a methodology and the questions due to ethnic background to be measured and acknowledge one's heritage. This book was created back in 2020. Sorry for taking so much time and speaking so fast, but over here, the weather, the climate, it's very hot in my country. But as I've said, structurally and systematically, we've suffered racism in Argentina. So we're vulnerable groups of the population. And in that sense, we've tried to build ourselves stronger. And I want to explain my content clearly and fast enough. I want to speak about present, the new history with the new general politics in Argentina. In Argentina now, we have a political project, and well, the government has its cutbacks. And those government cutbacks in my country led to a fast nullification or elimination of Afro-descendant programs, which were just embryos in our country. So the government cutbacks or the closure of the National Argentinian Institute Against Racism was simply eliminated. It was a venue where we could file our claims, and it was a place where we could have social, cultural activities. And the Afro descendants, we had that national programs to protect Afro descendants, the first time in its kind, constituted by the Argentinian government. You know, there was the Center of Studies of Afro Descendants. There was another government shutdown, you know, the Ministry of Afro Diversity for Women, where in these institutes protected Afro descendants. And these were places where we could have that protection, you know, and the Secretariat of Human Rights for the Nation was also disarticulated, you know, to protect refugees, stateless people, and migrants. And with this change of administration, all of these government institutions are done or gone. And I'm also working for the Shango Institute for Social Security. So these economic crisis and the economic recession and the political situation in Argentina generates all these grievances. And the government's there to protect human rights, all people's rights, and Afro descendants specifically, groups of our societies which are vulnerable and marginalized. And the government back in other administration was enforcing public policies, but now the situation has worsened in our societies, for our communities in general, but the situation's worsened for Afro descendants in Argentina. We're we're in all the nation, spread in all the territory, from Afro descendants to Patagonia, everywhere we're present. And in the last 20 years, there is a growth of migrant population in this country. There's many refugees seeking asylum of Afro descent. In Argentina, we think about the layers and the diasporas or the exodus of Afro descendant communities. Historically, Argentina has Argentina historically went through its colonialism, and there's Afro Brazilians, Afro Uruguayan people migrating, people from Haiti, Afro Dominicans, Afro Venezuelans, Afro Paraguayans. There's this last exodus and migration from people that are petitioning asylum and refuge from other countries, people from Ghana, from Cameroon, from Senegal. So you see the numbers of migrants. We have tried to quantify people from Senegal or Cameroon and how they're present in Argentina. In Argentina, to be visible, we'd have to see how many people have come to this country due to the diaspora or the migration of people. There's a lack of social security for Afro descendants, which are core subjects of the Inter American Conference. I know that Marta shared the matrix with the numbers that lead us to understand the lack of equality. So mirror yourselves in these other countries. Think about what's happening in Argentina. And we hope the Inter American Conference is an agency that can contribute and strengthen our efforts to protect our social security rights as Afro descendants and protect the migrant populations of African descent, which is part of what we're facing. There's gaps, and it's part of the problem. So I want to say that Afro descendant women, in their majority, are working as home workers or domestic workers. Their rights are violated constantly. They don't have access as Afro descendants working as domestic workers to social security benefits. So there's a law initiative to go through the amendments of a law to protect and provide social security benefits and retirement and pension schemes. So this government is trying to increase the retirement age to 65. So that's happening. So, in that regard, women are a vulnerable group of our populations that we have to observe and preserve and protect. Women must have access to social security benefits, medical services, and other pension schemes, thinking about retirement, you know? So there's another group of our population in my country that's extremely important. And we see our groups which are vulnerable. They don't have access to social security rights. And this group I talk about are our elders that are Afro Argentinian elders. They don't have access to pensions, or now we're in a process of trying to regulate and include them in our system, in the social security system, so they can receive a pension. If we include our elders in the earliest ages or earliest times when they have access to the workforce, then they pay their contribution so they can exercise their future rights and their when they're elders. The elders who are Afro descendants worry us a lot. Migrants who are of African descent are other groups of vulnerable minorities that are excluded from social securities and whose rights are violated constantly. So that's why we believe that in this conference, we can create bridges, we can cooperate amongst each other and create initiatives and projects and communicate to the governments and states so they can protect the vulnerable groups and their populations. We have to understand the grounds. The promise is social protection. We must include our people in their earliest ages. When our population is part of the workforce, we have to keep them and protect them in record and have a pension scheme. I mean, we have migrants coming to this country that are not even registered as part of the workforce. And last, I believe that it's fundamental for us to really analyze in a cross crop analysis of what's happening with people who are LGBTQ plus and trans and Afro-descendant in origin. So systematically, our Afro-descendant trans people and LGBTQ plus are not being included, are not being considered as part of the workforce. They're not part of a roster. Their rights are violated constantly when they're trying to have access to social security services, to medical services, to schemes or pensions, even. So it's very interesting to really try to visualize full scope of it and the tension that these vulnerable groups have to face when they're trying to fight to have access to social security benefits. We have that Afro descendant perspective. And what about our youth? We're trying to prevent all of these violations and include our youth in the job market to improve our kids, our youth's capacities and benefits and opportunities later on. Our youth in early stages can aspire to have access to the retirement ages, to future benefits, to really have access, to retirement, as I've said. And so it's very important for us to open and generate, trigger dialogue between economies. During the next decade, we can drive forward projects and programs with affirmative action to protect these vulnerable groups of society so we can really prevent. We don't want them to be in a precarious situation. We don't want to lack opportunities in the system. So we have to materialize programs that protect the rights of our people. And we must think about the elders, our seniors, because we see the Shango Collective, the Shango Association has open programs and workshops for the elderly, for the seniors, for different groups of the population. So it's a shame. If people, our elders reach retirement in a system, but there's no pension schemes, our elders who are in retirees, they cannot receive a pension, and they struggle throughout their their working years to achieve a pension and they don't have a pension. So we hope that when we open to dialogue in this panel, we can submit proposals so governments can guarantee access to benefits and social security and guarantee the elimination or eradication of discrimination and racism. We need to submit social projects so we can all include Afro descendants to social security benefits in their different types: migrants, women, males, youth, elderly. Thank you very much, Carlos. I think that you went to the general outline and you've explained what's happening with our Afro descendants. And I want to explain to the attendees and those who follow our streaming. In this conference, we have a list of priorities to draft programs and initiatives in this General Secretariat. This is a triennium. This administration is 2023-2025. In this triennium, we have many topics of research. We want social security to be universal. We have to pay close attention to these groups in which have historically been violated but do not have the rights or benefits. The Afro-descendant communities are vulnerable. The LGBTQ communities are vulnerable. At the beginning, you mentioned the norms, the general acts that David mentioned. We have that frame that ensures the protection of those rights of Afro descendants. So this conference wants to have this matter. These themes are a subject of debate so we can continue for this robust dialogue. And we must build together these initiatives. If you allow me to pause, we'll pause for a couple of minutes. We've received your questions from those who are audience. We've received your questions. You're going to receive an answer. Thank you for sharing all your slideshows. Thank you for sending us your feedback or observations. We're going to submit the answers to you immediately. We're going to give ourselves a pause so we can start the next panel in which we're going to speak about the workforce, inclusion in the workforce, occupation of our people. I don't want to close this panel without thanking our three panel members that have been great. Thank you very much. At the screen, we have specific themes of the tables. Let's all take notes. So at the panel, we can trigger the rest of our activities. We have to build strong initiatives to have an impact. We thank you on behalf of the General Secretariat and the Inter-American Conference on Social Security and Studies. So we're going to give ourselves a pause to start the next panel. Thank you very much.
comenzamos con este segundo panel. Agradecemos su paciencia por los minutos que vamos retrasados. El segundo panel aborda...
Second panel will talk about the work insertion and inequities in the occupational structure. And in this panel, we'll have the participation of two specialists and great ally of the conference, Inter-American Conference on Social Security, a member of our conference, and specialists from the organization of the ILO. So in this panel, we'll have the chance to analyze the inequities referring to opportunities of access and permanence of the work and the segmentation of the and discrimination, racial discrimination, and how this has an incidence in the possibilities of access and permanence in employment. On the other hand, we'll talk about the obstacles that youngster people have in transition of uh, labor and school spaces and impact the COVID-19 pandemic had informal and domestic work too. Domestic work will be something that will be talked about in the third panel today. Then we'll have the participation of these two specialists and activists who will share their knowledge. I will allow myself to introduce our first panel member, whom as I said, is somebody we love very much in the conference, and I really thank for her collaboration. I'm talking about Dr. Amanda Monsalve, researcher from the Grand Columbia University, who's political science specialists, and he has worked in CFT, ILO, Castilla-La Mancha University, who is in the CISS. From 1989, he has been working. She's a researcher by her university, a member of the Ibero-American Academy of Right to Work and Social Security. She has been in different forums. She has published several articles, and she has coordinated more than 30 books in her field. Thank you very much, Doctor. Well, good afternoon, beloved Dr. Oscar. First of all, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I really thank CISS and the organizers of this event, yourself, and my congratulations for your team that does a good job all the time, and for those that were before me in their presentations. So, within the topic I've been asked to talk about in labor insertion on equity in the occupational structure, I have prepared some content with an introduction. Uh, 111 Covenant in 1958 in ILO, definition of discrimination, as well as informality as a factor for discrimination, socio-political causes and economical causes, informality in figures, to talk about a little bit about my country, solution to informality, and conclusions. And then I have based specifically on informality because I do believe that it's one of the most determining factors of inequity. So we say that this inequity has been inserted in humankind history in the book Fuerza de las Palabras from Reader Digest in 1977. We extract the sense of adjectives to qualify, in this case, what is not the same, equal. With these in mind, we face several inequities, several stages in order to get to men and women genetically are not the same. And they do their different roles in society. They have faced inequities. Some have been due to this difference that according to the great dictionary of synonyms, antonyms, and alike ideas by Tirso Morrison in 1980 defines disparity divergency, diversity, on equity on page 147 that makes us conclude that our Spanish language uh, talks about those possibilities. The role of women before recreating nature takes her away from the possibilities of education that is obtained very late, and it is located at home, taking care for kids, and the man as a provider of the house. It is with time that we overcome these stages, and women have access to secondary studies and then later on to superior studies, and that opens doors of the labor world. You know, I'm dragging that inequity that gave them the adjective of weak sex with some cultural connotations, and they're not justified at all. What does the Covenant 111 tells us about this in 1958 from ILO? Facing this inequity from far away, the ILO, through this agreement, defines in their first article, quotation marks, the term of discrimination comprehends any kind of discrimination, job or occupation, and generates for the member states the commitment to promote legislation that prohibits any kind of discrimination and exclusion in any form based upon race, color, sex, religion, political opinion, national or social origin. Then, in Agreement 100 from 1951, this very same organization had foreseen salary equity before the same job, the same pay. And 156 that was environed in 1983 about opportunity equity among workers, male and female, before family responsibilities. You know, these we've marked this discrimination with. She is just to indicate that that inherited inequity from long time ago was evident, and it is necessary to eradicate it. It's something different or difficult in machista or male societies in countries where they are colonizing influence, especially from Spain, which they're machistas. After 4 centuries of Arabic domination, where the capitis diminution condition is not overcame completely. These international instruments have not been enough that have been adopted by many legislations. Not totally, because the ratification process of agreements on the part of a member countries, due to the lack of proactive measurements from ILO, continues to be very low, with exception of one, which is considered worldwide in 1964 about employment policy, and now 190 from the centennial, with a great force for the worldwide ratification. Informality as a factor of inequity. For ILO, informality is a labor relationship which is not subject to national legislation, does not pay taxes, does not have any social protection coverage, and lacks benefits related to employment, job, or we may add that it does not have the recognition of an occupation, and thus without any protection. labor protection. So the sociological phenomena are not generated spontaneously. They come from causes, and especially that one of informality has them in socioeconomic and political aspects. It is not in vain that from the beginning of the Agreement 156 about policies of employment for the Specialized Organization of United Nations talks about the importance of generating employment policies which are pretty necessary in countries in development that are far from being reached because the job departments become bureaucratical offices where politics exercised, especially in the governments called as progressive. As for economies, the world has suffered in the last century. In 1930, Asian tigers in 1987, financial in the United States in 2008, besides those generated from the world wars that which now we are suffering from, and the internal ones caused by guerrillas, drug traffickers, and groups against the law, which creates instability and lack of safety that uh, takes capitals away, and there's not investment. And there are serious risks for entrepreneurs to begin businesses.
In addition to those phenomena, then we have these left-wing governments, as we have already discussed. And unfortunately, in Latin America, we know that they have had some sort of proliferation over the past 50 years. However, as a cyclic phenomenon, they're now going back to this right wing in very difficult situations, facing some um, governments that have been destroyed, such as the Argentinian one. They have had an inflation of 111%. This is a percentage that is impossible to reach this type of financial stability. So once we know that we see this type of informality and access to what we found, and in a very recent publication, we found in the weekly journal of the Republic of País, we found in the analysis section in page number 2, we found a table that is reporting informal economies based on data from the ILO information. And there's another one that addresses employment informality in Latin America as well, where they state this type of insufficient unequal recovery, where we see 58.4% recovery in Colombia. This number was also just given by a copy in an event that we had in the University of Great Colombia or Universidad de Gran Colombia on past August the 21st. We also have Mexico with 56.6%. We have Brazil, 38.5%, and Chile, a very low one, which is at 27.4%. Now, in this same report, we can tell that we are seeing a process of just making professions less formal, that in the past used to be formal. This is in page 7. And this piece of information goes back to 1990 something. I do not recall the number. But if we go back to this third quarter of 2021, we see that a large percentage of workers and a third of wage employees, they were not informal. If we consider the concept of the ILO, specifically for formal jobs or employments, in one of the publications, in one of the editions that we see of Mi Trabajo or My Work publications, in previous crises, the informality rate used to drop and to be decreased in the most critical period. This is according to what was advised by by that body. However, in 2021, we found that these informal occupations were the ones that were leading partial recovery of employment. A tight link between formality, work formality, low income, inequality as well, which have become more and more evident in this context. So, end of the quote of the ILO. What is the solution that we can find for this informality? Once we have analyzed these causes as we have done so far, we need to strengthen the different employment policies in the countries that have the highest rates of informality to favor investment by providing financial and tax informality. And we know that these tax rates are unsteady and stable and are just somehow scaring away our foreign investments. This legal uncertainty is another factor that is going to just drive this type of investment. And as well, whenever we talk about labor and tax matters, we know that before high courts, we're going to face a lot of legal uncertainty since we know that they do not know what to face. Given all of this legal uncertainty, as we have mentioned before, this environment of violence that we have found in many countries due to internal conflicts, guerrilla, all types of uh, confrontation between the different armed groups. We see drug dealing groups as well. And we also have specific situations taking place in countries such as countries that are just really facing serious political conflicts. All of this is creating a lot of legal uncertainty. These acts of violence have become more and more deep, I would say, deeper they become. And this criminal management is now scaring all of our determining factors that could lead us to an economic growth. Here's a factor, nonetheless, that is seriously threatening the economies of the different countries, its own demography, and the way we have seen how the society has become more stable, how their customs and traditions have changed. And I'm talking about, once more, those immigration waves, I would call it. And at this time, we know that we are absolutely fearing what is going to take place in Venezuelan border because we have around 13,000 immigrants in Venezuela. What are we going to do with them? So now through social security protection across its all 9 branches from its very beginning and until a president dies, well, it provides for protection, and that's the only way for us to be able to eradicate this informality. We are a bit pessimistic with this outlook, specifically of what's going to take place in Latin America and also in the US and Europe, where we know that the different political situations are going to have an impact on the different economies and growth and employment generation for us to be able to combat poverty and inequality, well-being, also through social protection at a universal level. And as well, we have peace, political conflicts that are as serious as the one taking place in Venezuela and Nicaragua, where we absolutely have no respect for human rights. It is not easy to think of a brighter future that we're all looking for. So, just to conclude, and not to exceed my time, the time that has been granted to me, I just wanted to mention that for us to be able to combat inequality in our structures, it is urgent and necessary first generate, of course, wealth, dignified work with an equal and fair salary, non-discrimination at the job place, using and enacting all types of work-related policies. 3, to check enforcement with international labor standards and legislation, and also just ensuring that a type of race can be also respected, and equal pay, specifically because we know that there is a gender gap in terms of salaries and wages. Usually, men earn more than women, even if they are performing the same job, for to maximize equal opportunities, not only in terms of training, education, but access to job positions, both for men and women. Fifth, to just make sure that the ILO's conventions are enforced as per the Centennial Report in 2019, social universal protection. All of this is going to be performed through financing so as to ensure sustainability. Without this, it would be impossible to be able to reach a true equality position. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Monsalvo. So I know that it is very important to talk about informality, and I do agree um, with what you just mentioned. I also wanted to share with you that next week we're going to have the first technical summit. It's going to be a technical summit on the Caribbean and Latin American countries, or ELAC. They're going to be addressing this labor informality. So again, this presentation by Mrs. Monsalve is definitely just the opening door to all of these topics in Afro-descendant communities as well, facing this type of informality at work. I know that we used to have in the past some jobs that used to be formal. Now they have become more informal. So we do have different schemes that were not even foreseen or contemplated as part of their labor market. So thank you so much, Mrs. Monsalve. I would like to ask you to please stay here in the room in case we have the more questions from the audience. So now I would like to pass the floor to Master Almeida. They're going to be addressing some topics on ILO. We know that Mr. Almeida is also an expert on social and solidarity topics by the ILO in Geneva. He's also part of the Secretariat of the UN Intergovernment Group. He encompasses topics such as gender equality, demographics, market research, and consumption. He is also focusing on informal economy, formal economy, and also in working for fair economies. He has a PhD by the UCHATE University and a master's degree by the American University of Beirut in the ILO. He has served as an expert in non-discrimination for indigenous peoples. He is also working with all types of knowledge management. He is a social expert. So please, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and good morning and from Geneva. So actually here it's rather in the evening. I'm very pleased to be joining you today in this very important event, and thank you very much once again for inviting me. My presentation will cover indeed a number of topics, including topics that are quite related to the previous presentation. So this is something that that will be important. I will make sure to minimize the overlap in that sense, so to make it as effective and to the point as possible. And I know as well that as the event has been a bit delayed, I will make sure to be as timely as I can. So can you all see my screen now? Yes. So first, I want to start with the principle that the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation is a fundamental right. And this fundamental right is enshrined in the ILO Constitution, specifically in the Philadelphia Declaration that was adopted in 1944 and has been part of the ILO Constitution since 1946. And it states that all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security, and equal opportunity. I really want to emphasize this because this gives an overarching framework with respect to what I'm going to present next. And this principle itself is also has been developed in subsequent international labor standards, particularly the Discrimination, Employment and Occupation Convention, of 1958, number 111. And this convention, which has been emphasized in the previous presentation, has near universal ratification. The principle itself is also enshrined in the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, specifically in relation to the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Now, I want to elaborate a bit more for us to understand a bit how an ILO perspective or International Labor Standards perspective can give us insights in relation to the concept of labor inclusion. The concept of labor inclusion in itself is relatively new. It has been promoted by ECLAC as involving two components: labor market insertion, so that is access to the labor market, and working conditions, that is access to decent work. Now, from an ILO perspective, with a focus specifically on the convention number 111, we can relate to this conceptualization through the focus on equality of opportunity and treatment in employment and occupation. And specifically, these two terms, employment and occupation, include access to vocational training, access to employment and to particular occupations. So employment in general, so having a job, and particular occupations. So that's something that's also important in that sense to ensure that different groups have equal access to all kinds of occupations and not finding themselves pushed towards a certain type of occupations. So these two elements are really related to the labor market insertion in that sense. But then there is the component of terms and conditions of employment, which is also very important. And I want to elaborate a bit more because this is not in the text of the convention, but in the interpretation by the Committee of Experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. And that is that access to employment and to particular occupations depends on access to land, access to finance, and access to the goods and services necessary for carrying out a specific occupation. And in that sense, all kinds of jobs are covered by the convention. And it covers, for example, access to wage employment and to self-employment, as well as to public service and to employers and workers' organizations. So as you can see, I'm trying to give now an ILO perspective to the concept of labor inclusion. Having done so, I want to emphasize that respect for fundamental principles and rights at work, other human rights, and international labor standards is critical for the labor inclusion of Afro-descendant women and men in the Americas. And I believe many of you are familiar with the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. It was adopted in 1998 and amended in 2022. And its basic message is that there are fundamental conventions that include principles and rights at work that need to be respected and promoted and realized by all ILO members, even if they have not ratified the related conventions. So that includes freedom of association and the effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, the elimination of all forms of forced and compulsory labor, the effective abolition of child labor, the elimination of discrimination in respect of employment and occupation, which I have just discussed, and a safe and healthy working environment, which is the amendment since 2022. Now, if you look at the Committee of Experts comments related to the application of specific conventions, you will see that in recent years, and by that I have reviewed the comments since 2020, so in the past few years, you will see that the situation of people of African descent in the Americas has been addressed by the Committee of Experts in a range of conventions. And these include, first, Convention number 111, and that's really the one where that is the most prominent in that regard. It also includes the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, number 169. And this is very important, particularly that in a number of countries, Afro-descendants are considered as part of tribal peoples. Moreover, across the region, we have indigenous peoples and people of African descent are often the most disadvantaged in the world of work. And often their disadvantages are closely related for historical and structural reasons. So that's an important point. Then there is the Employment Policy Convention, which addresses employment policy in general, the Domestic Workers Convention, and on domestic workers, I will come back in a moment. There are conventions that are related to the fundamental principles and rights at work. There's also the Social Policy Convention, the Plantations Convention, also very important, and conventions related to human resources development and vocational rehabilitation and employment. And that's specifically for persons with disabilities. As you can see, there is really the issue or the concerns and rights of people of African descent are really cross-cutting across all international labor standards. So what I have cited is simply examples of explicitly addressing their situation in the comments of the Committee of Experts. Now I want to move to some empirical evidence in relation to the framework I have presented earlier about what we mean by equality of opportunity and treatment in employment and occupation. First, as you can see, is that Afro-descendant women and men often have lower access to education and training. So the data is, a lot of it is really from ECLAC, with some complements from work we have done at the ILO. As you can see here, for example, that in most countries with data available, Afro-descendant women and men typically have lower educational attainment than other groups. And to specify is that non-Afro-descendant is also non-indigenous. So that's just to clarify. Second important, so that was about access to education and training, which is often a key prerequisite for access to specific occupations. Now, in relation to access to employment in general, we can see here that although the participation rates don't show a very clear pattern, so across countries, we can see in relation to the unemployment rate, the clear pattern emerges. And specifically, the Afro-descendant population has higher unemployment rates than the non-Afro-descendant and non-indigenous population, with women typically having higher rates than both men, Afro-descendants, and non-Afro-descendant women. And as you can see, the specific examples of the countries that may be of interest to you. I won't go into the details of the numbers just for the sake of time. Now, in relation to the topic really of this session, the key point is that the vertical and horizontal job structure is a critical determinant of labor outcomes. And by vertical job structure, I mean in relation to the international standard classification of occupations. So as you can see here, you have, you can visualize it in a sense with managers at the top and elementary occupations at the bottom. And what I mean by top and bottom, this is typically in relation to skill levels, as you can see in front of you. And in relation to horizontal job structures, this is what is, that is in relation to the international standard classification of all activities, the international standard industrial classification of all economic activities. So that is what is typically known as an economic sector. And as you can see, there's agriculture, industry, and services, and you have more specific categories. Now, if we take that into account, we'll see that Afro-descendants, particularly women, are overrepresented in low productivity jobs. That's really an important point because low productivity is often an issue, particularly when it relates to informality. And gaps, productivity gaps and informality gaps are often related. It does not mean that one is the same as the other. So you can have high productivity workers who are in the informal economy. However, statistically, it's important to look at the issue of productivity. Then if we look at the top and the bottom of the vertical job structure, you will notice that Afro-descendants tend to be overrepresented in elementary occupations and underrepresented in managerial occupations. Now, because this requires a number of, here I'm just giving the example of Brazil, and this is very clear here that the pattern is very clear when you look at Black women and men in elementary occupations. So only indigenous men have higher shares of elementary occupations in total employment than Afro-descendant men. And then, as you can see, Afro-descendant women and men have the lowest rates of managerial occupation in total employment. Now, specifically, and this is part of the issues in this panel, I want to focus here on domestic work, which is often considered as part of elementary occupations. And Afro-descendant women are overrepresented in the care economy, particularly paid domestic work. The care economy is broader than the domestic work. It includes, for example, nursing, health, education, and other sectors. But here I just want to focus on the paid domestic work, and specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean, an estimated 93% of workers in domestic employment were women, based on 2010 census data. Moreover, close to 2/3, specifically 63%, were Afro-descendant. And something to keep in mind, and this is interesting, for example, in a court case at the highest level in South Africa, that the exclusion of specific categories of workers, specifically in this case domestic workers, can be the basis of indirect discrimination. So when specific categories of workers have overrepresentation of specific groups, so in this case Afro-descendant women, their exclusion from labor law, from social security law, etc., may amount to indirect discrimination. So this is something from a legal perspective that is worth considering. On the right, you see a number of measures and recommendations to guarantee the rights of domestic workers, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that includes, for example, promoting comprehensive social protection systems, encouraging the regularization of domestic work, encouraging social dialogue, promoting digital and financial inclusion and literacy, also legal advice, information, awareness campaigns, and the ratification and implementation of ILO Conventions 189 and 190. Relatedly, now that you have seen some of the determinants in terms of job structure, we can see that Afro-descendants are often overrepresented in the informal economy. So on the left, you see estimates about the probability of working in the informal sector. And in 3 of the 4 countries, the probability is significant when one is Afro-descendant, whereas in this case in Ecuador, the probability decreases when one is an Afro-descendant. The details of which, of course, are worth further study. On the right, you can see informal employment in Brazil. And here as well, you see that Afro-descendant women and men have significantly higher informality than white and Asian groups. However, you see that indigenous and mixed race groups have even higher informality. So when the presentation focuses on Afro-descendants, however, we need to keep in mind that the different groups, different ethnic groups need consideration. In fact, all ethnic groups need consideration when we're talking about ethnic inequality and racial discrimination. So related to the issue of informality is the issue of social security coverage. And you can see here that Afro-descendants typically have lower social security coverage. And the example here is specifically on pensions. And so in every case is available in front of you in relation to both, in general, women and men. So that's also something, a key message in that regard. And when we're talking about this, it's important to keep in mind the extension of social protection, both horizontally and vertically. Now, the next point I want to make is in relation to income, and specifically, Afro-descendants typically receive a lower hourly labor income, and there is a significant gender gap. So Afro-descendant women are typically paid less, and here I'm focusing on the higher levels of education, so complete or incomplete tertiary education. We see that Afro-descendant women are paid less, followed by non-Afro-descendant women, and then Afro-descendant men, and non-Afro-descendant men. So a key point is that both ethnicity and gender gaps in pay are important, and also the fact that that gap may actually increase at maybe higher levels of education. Now, if we look at the issue of policies in general, we see that labor inclusion programs often focus on the supply side. So that is training, education, support for self-employment. And there is, however, a minority that also addresses job creation, both direct and indirect, as well as labor intermediation services. Now, if you look at the focus of the different labor inclusion programs, we see here that a few of them in the region actually focus on Afro-descendants. So this is about the empirical evidence. Now I want to move to more general recommendations from an ILO perspective. First, in relation to inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, it's important to take into account the specific circumstances and vulnerabilities of different groups, including people of African descent, and other groups such as migrants, indigenous and tribal peoples, ethnic minorities, older persons, persons with disabilities, and persons living with HIV/AIDS. This is really emphasized in the global call to action of 2021. It's also important as well that this focus should be as part of a broader support for sustainable enterprises, jobs, and income from a gender responsive perspective, and tailoring to specific situations and taking into account national circumstances and priorities. Because I'm coming here from a more international perspective, it's always important to emphasize context specificity. So I don't give the impression that there is a one-size-fits-all approach that we can adopt. The context is critical in every case, in alignment with universal rights. Now, I want to emphasize specifically the social and solidarity economy can be leveraged by Afro-descendant women and men for social inclusion, including in the care economy. And here I'm providing some elements from recent resolutions by the ILO in recent years. So by the social and solidarity economy, the term itself is diverse in different countries. So it may be, for example, solidarity economy in some countries, social economy in others, etc. But the key point is that it includes a range of enterprise or entity types, including cooperatives, associations, mutuals, foundations, social enterprises, and the like, but all of them operating in accordance with the values and principles of the social and solidarity economy. So that's the first point. And here self-help groups are often important, particularly in the informal economy. And the ILO definition includes both informal and formal entities in that economy. And what is needed is enabling environment for sustainable enterprises and a conducive environment for social and solidarity economy entities, including gender responsive policies that promote productivity, investment, education, and skills, and also enhancing access to business opportunities, formalization, and finance. Here, I just want to show you briefly the values and principles of the social and solidarity economy, because they are mentioned in the previous slides. And some of the key elements include equality and fairness, care for people and planet, the attainment of decent work and livelihoods, democratic and participatory governance, and the primacy of people and social purpose over capital. Just giving you these brief ideas to emphasize how really the social and solidarity economy can benefit the social inclusion and the labor inclusion of Afro-descendants. Now, if you want to go even broader, it's important to ensure gender equality and non-discrimination and promote equality, diversity, and inclusion. As I can see that I have passed 20 minutes or so, I will be brief for the remainder. I just want to say briefly that it's important to have integrated and comprehensive approaches that take into account the impact of intersecting personal identities, as well as the conditions of vulnerability, and addressing equality throughout the entire life cycle, and includes addressing things like stereotypes, discriminatory laws and practices, and addressing also equal pay for work of equal value, tackling occupational segregation, and increasing the availability of disaggregated data. And disaggregated data was really addressed in more detail in the previous panel. So I will not go in details. I just want to emphasize that there has been significant progress in that regard in the region. And there is the question in some cases of whether it is a good idea to measure ethnicity. So from an old perspective, it's important that inclusive and equitable social dialogue contributes to determining this, and that any such measurement be consistent with the human rights approach to data. So that includes self-identification, participation, and the like. Now, when we look at indicators, it's also important to cover decent work indicators to monitor progress for Afro-descendants. That includes the 10 substantive elements of decent work, as well as the economic and social context for that work. It's necessary to address the situation of Afro-descendants in national equality policies. So that's really the broad title that the ILO uses in relation to promoting equality. And some of the elements include universality, such as universal education, compulsory and free of charge, and also more targeted measures, for example, in relation to access to land, credit, and resources. It's important to cover both direct and indirect discrimination, as well as discrimination-based harassment in legislation, and also to address intersectionality. Proactive measures to address discrimination are diverse. So here are some recent examples from Costa Rica, Brazil, Uruguay, for example. Also worth noting in relation to the introduction to this event that some countries have acknowledged colonialism and transatlantic slave trade as key elements, as well as considering reparations. Now, before I go to general recommendations of racial discrimination, I just want to say that the title of this panel is about the job structure specifically, but I want to emphasize that if you want to go even broader, particularly from a gender equality perspective, it's important to look at all forms of work, including work that is not employment. So that is on-use production work, for example, which is often known as unpaid care work. You can see here that in the world, for example, women spend on average 276 minutes in such work compared to 110 by men. And the total work of women is typically higher than men around the world when we include both paid and paid work in general and unpaid work. But there's also, other than unpaid care work, there is unpaid training work, volunteer work, and other forms of work such as unpaid community service and unpaid work by prisoners, for example. Finally, and to conclude, there are a range of recommendations for addressing racial discrimination in the world of work. And this is specifically from a general observation by the Committee of Experts that was adopted in 2018. And important part, and this is really to put the issues of Afro-descendants in a broader context, it's important to address the situation of all ethnic groups, taking into account the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, to consult the social partners and interested groups. So in this case, for example, Afro-descendants specifically, to promote substantive equality, to address both all forms of employment, to also monitor, as I noted earlier, raise awareness, enhance the capacity of authorities, particularly the enforcement authorities, but also constituents more generally, and to ensure that the enforcement and the remedies are primarily through civil law rather than criminal law. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias. Creo que ha sido una presentación totalmente enfocada y enriquecedora para complementar la presentación de la doctora.
So we will continue with Dr. Monsalve's presentation. There's a couple of questions, and I think we have sufficient time to get an answer from each and every one of you. So Dr. Monsalve, this question's for you, ma'am. From ILO's perspective, which are the strategies that could facilitate countries' implementation and adoption and ratification of the recommendations of ILO in this matters to fight the lack of regulations, or what could we do to improve best practices and to narrow the labor gaps? In a few minutes, Mr. Almeida, we're going to ask you another question. So they're asking which are the main challenges that ILO has observed or found in the occupation field in Latin American countries, and which are the measures that we can implement to improve the levels or the numbers? Can we improve these numbers so it could all continue growing? I don't know, Ms. Marta Monsalve, would you like to take the floor first, and then Mr. Almeida? Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Oscar. And I thank the person that has formulated this question. You have touched some very important points here. The reason, why would the member states simply not ratify the conventions or this agreements when they're engaged with the conventions and they're committed. When they ratify and adopt these, ILO does not have the claw, or you might think nothing's happening, and the countries that are part submit every December an executive report about the reasons why they haven't ratified a specific convention or treaty, because when they ratify, then it's enforcement internally in those economies. They might submit the report specifying because it's rained so much, or it was the pandemic, or it's so sunny outside, or economic reasons, and nothing happens. So there's no penalty, there's no sanction. Unfortunately, then human beings, us as humanity, have gotten used to it, and there's no reaction, and there's censorship. And I've said this publicly in ILO sessions. You have studied the causes, or cause the root causes why countries haven't ratified treaties. It's such a shame. We don't have a study based on on the causes. If we don't know the root cause of the nays, then how are we gonna clarify that? And it's impossible. Then the first thing that we'd have to do, the core of ILO, is implement and ratify. Which are the countries that aren't ratifying these conventions? We need to understand the underlying reason. There's other countries that are permanently ratifying. Colombia has ratified 73 conventions or covenants. We're ratifying all these, and it makes it compulsory. It's our mandate. Why? Because countries have their fears. They're fearing that ratification or engagement when they have burdens which are economic in nature. The a case is that Convention 152 that dates back to 1952. When we started the examination of that instrument for us to submit that recommendation of 2002, there were 23 countries that had ratified that convention. And there were it had in the spirit or the body, the minimum rights that were protected in it. And we thought that after ratifying that convention would be ratified by many. From 23, 33 countries ratified it out of 183 member states. Then we go back to the same points. What's the root cause of the lack of ratification? To find the remedy. So we have to really tighten the nuts and bolts at, through the ILO, to call in the member states that adopt, because it's a mandate. So if you adopt after 12 months, you have to enforce the law and harmonize it with your internal law. So there's terms that come to an end. There's no more time. So that's my comment regarding the first question that you've asked. So the second section of the question is, how do we narrow the gaps? I think that after you've heard my presentation, I'll tell you that I'm absolutely convinced about the fact that social protection, is the right means for us to really redistribute the economic capital, or to fight lack of fairness or equity, and to have that coverage. And if we provide coverage and services in those 9 segments of Social Security, we can achieve certain level of tranquility in our societies, and stability, and equity, and fairness. We have to produce job opportunities, a strong economy. If not, how is this going to happen? If there's countries waiting to have subsidies, budget, and to ask for more and more and more, let's not dream about taking that path. And then if we run out of budget, what's going to happen? Let's continue working, working, and working. Let's be countries or economies that produce prosperous economy. It's not just one entity's job, because the way in which we all work has changed a lot. There's other ways of generating income. Let's generate a robust, prosperous economy for it to be correctly distributed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Monsalve. I think the ILO and any international global body has in its spirit the objective or desire to build strong states and economies. So the countries really ratify the treaties and conventions, which are the mandate of the member states. So we have to go through that thorough analysis of the root cause of why economies are not ratifying these conventions and treaties. So the next question is about the main challenges that ILO has detected in insertion to the job opportunities, and which are the measures to implement so we can improve the opportunities and to have those obstacles simply be eliminated. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. So, this is really a complex question, and I have tried to address it in my presentation. For more details at the country level, I would invite colleagues to look at the ILO website, and specifically NormLegs is the part of the ILO website that has the comments of the Committee of Experts by convention and by country, including also cases, etc. Now, to complement what I have presented, and I'm really grateful for the question because it allows me to give some additional elements. First, one big challenge is the issue of restricted fiscal and policy space. Mrs. Monsalve has already alluded to it, but this is really a key challenge. So that's the first one. The second point is in relation to policy coherence and coordination. What happens is you have so many different agendas, the different government mandates and institutional mandates, etc. And so making sure that there is coherence and coordination. To give an example, there could be, for example, the social dimension. So for example, in relation to the empowerment of Afro-descendants, since this is the topic of conversation, and their labor inclusion, that can be considered as a social, as part of the social agenda, but the economic agenda may be given the priority. So the economic agenda may be given more resources and priorities at the policy level, and itself may be in fact undermining what would be the social agenda. And so that's really a big challenge, especially that the recommendations for economic policies, for example, for the Ministry of Finance, of Economy, Industry, Central Bank, etc. These are often don't have a decent work or social and labor inclusion at the heart of them. So that's a big challenge. Another important challenge is even when there are a ratification of conventions or also laws and policies that are adopted, there's the difficulty of implementation in practice for all categories of persons. And here I want to emphasize the issue of the informal economy. So the ILO recommendation number 204 on the transition from the informal to the formal economy can be very relevant in that regard. And it really provides for an integrated approach and comprehensive approach to addressing this issue, because informality is often related to non-implementation in practice. So people may say we have great laws and policies, but they are not being implemented. That's often an issue that can be addressed with the transition to the formal economy. Now, in addition to improving policies and legislation, which is something I have emphasized, something that I want to also note is the importance of organizing. There's the principle of nothing with us, nothing about us without us. And so here it's very important for the organizing of the different groups. They can be in relation to occupation, sectors, etc. They can also be in relation to specific issues. So for example, in relation to the rights of Afro-descendants. And in that sense, organizing, including in employers' organizations, in workers' organizations, in organization of workers in the informal economy, but also organizing through enterprises, particularly in the social and solidarity economy. This can be also very important avenues in that regards. Finally, and this is something that has been addressed in the previous two sessions, there is connecting the knowledge that exists both in academia, in institutions, but also the lived experiences of Afro-descendants and other groups. So connecting the knowledge to the decision-making and the implementation, this is also something very important. statistics can play a role, but it can only give a very partial role, hence the importance of participation, social dialogue, and civil dialogue as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Almeida. Thank you for your answer. You've spoken about how to implement the international conventions and treaties to nations, to economies, but these implementations should be owned by the societies and watched over by our international agencies. Well, I'd like to thank Ms. Almeida and Ms. Monsalve for your participation throughout the panel. I thank you on behalf of the Inter-American Conference on Social Security Studies. Thank you for being part this collective effort during this afternoon panel. I applaud you all. Thank you for being active and participating with us all. Thank you. We're not very delayed in today's agenda, so if you'd allow me, permit me, we're going to open and celebrate the next panel that in which we're going to talk about social security, domestic workers, community service, Afro-descendants, opportunities. And during this panel, I'm honored to open the floor for another great ally and friend this conference. And I thank her for having opened this time frame and her agenda to moderate the session. I speak of Dr. Carolina Galindo from the Ministry of Labor of the Republic of Colombia, and I'll briefly read her achievements. Dr. Carolina, after I introduce you, you'll take the floor. Dr. Carolina is from Bogota, attorney. She has a master's in law in Colombia with a higher education, postgrad studies in education. She's been in the public as a public official working for 15 years, drafting public policies to achieve transparency. And she's also in her endeavors fought corruption. She's been passed of the Senate of her republic, and she's part of the collective who drafted and awarded the General Act for Employment Rights. She was the vice minister in the criminal restorative justice. She's also led other agencies in the criminal justice system in Colombia and incumbent in the International Affairs Unit. She was an inspector of the territory allocation and she's also worked for the criminal justice system in her nation. She's also exercised her profession in specific jurisdiction. She has a lot of experience as a professor, researcher in political sciences, thanks to the National University, and she has been in different positions working in the field of education in many universities. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Carolina. The floor is yours. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Yes? Okay. The first point, I would like to thank Brandon, our dear underlead of correlation or liaison in the Inter-American Conference on Social Security for the invite. I'm honored to be part of the panel. The name of the panel it will provoke many reactions. Domestic workers and community works or services for descendants in population. So this subject is very robust. It's really catches my attention. And I stress on these points. We have to pay close attention to the segment of community services. So I'd like to first thank all the people that are now following the streaming, all the attendees and the panel members as well. It's a pleasure for me to greet you all to this first forum or panel in which we frame the clear vision of Social Security rights for Afro-descendants. This event it's material today. It's going to continue today till tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. Mexico City time. And we'll continue with a sequence of panels from until 12:30 in Peru. And in Bolivia, this will wrap up at 3:30 p.m. Just a clear reminder for you all to know the schedule or so you can all connect on time so we can continue this important dialogue. During this panel, as Brandon said, we're going to have the opportunity to visualize and to discuss the problems and challenges that women that are working, domestic workers that are receiving a wage in Latin America, focusing specifically on the case of Afro-descendant women that are domestic workers that receive a wage, but are also serving in their population, as well as their participation in community services. We will try to discuss the stigmas that are affecting the segment of the population, as well as the lack of coverage and protection of these groups of our communities in our population. So we're going to have the participation of 3 expert panel members. They're activists. They're globally known. They will share their knowledge regarding these topics. They're sharing their experience. So we hope this panel really invites us to be thoughtful, mindful. Let's open to dialogue. Let's be sensitive enough and understanding so we can build awareness and consciousness in our societies to dignify the job opportunities out there for all. So now we're ready to start the panel. And without further ado, I will now take the floor to submit to all our guests and all our attendees, the following information. I want to introduce Cleide Pereira Pinto, General Secretary of the Latin American and Caribbean Lead for Domestic Workers. Cleide Pereira is a known professional with experience in the field of social security and human rights. She has worked building different initiatives or laws focused on inclusion and protecting the most vulnerable in our communities, assuming taking head on the risks and escalating this debate at international arenas. Her professional development has been marked by her solid engagement. She's a fighter for social justice and equality. She's a key element, and she's fostering policies, the creation of policies to improve the quality of life of our people. Cleide has focused clearly on her capacity to lead projects that generate a positive impact in societies. We have a second guest at the panel, Laura Victoria Gomez Correa. She's the leader or incumbent of Oxfam Colombia. Laura Victoria has accrued over 20 years of experience to develop economies. She's been drafting strategic programs. She's also administrating educational programs. She's worked with the United Nations of the European Union, and she's worked with different international government agencies. She's worked with other civil society agencies or bodies in Colombia and other Latin American countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and Argentina. She's an expert in gender, public policy. She has gone through the assessment or examination of the creation how laws in Colombia and many economies. She's part of the program of Oxfam in Colombia. She has a master's thanks to the Javerian University of Bogota. And our third guest is Samuel Samuels. He's the technical secretary of the national agency which coordinates the Afro-descendant Panamanians. Samuels has strengthened his career working with other communities in Panama with different groups of different ethnicities. He's built strategies and programs that are created to include different members of society and activating economic growth with different chambers in to solidify economies. So for the past few years, he has strategically planned programs continuously improving the experiences of the stakeholders involved, finding high levels of dominion of tools like Office and other tools that exist, so which are used in different programs. He has been appointed as the strategic advisor as well, and has been in his position working to broaden the social impact of his duties. In his new position, he is working in cooperation with different stakeholders involved to define sustainable frameworks that include the voices of minorities. The minorities' rights should be acknowledged in such dynamic societies. So, as you can see, we have 3 panels of top level first quality. And without further ado, I want to open the floor for our first panel member, Ms. Cleide Pereira Pinto. Thank you, ma'am. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, I just would like to thank you for the invite. I'm really glad to be here today in this panel today, just talking about my category, which is domestic workers. I am as general secretary. I'm going to talk just a bit about what is domestic work. It is work conducted at the home of another person in exchange of a compensation. That's according to the ILO's definition. It includes also this duty of either caring after someone, cleaning, and others. It is one of the main categories of employment for women and also for Black women. I'm sorry, I got lost here. It is a profession that was marked by colonial situations because of a matter of gender, class, race. And that's when we started to also consider that this type of domestic work was more productive. So now this is becoming more and more relevant. And also, we know that they always thought that we as women would do out of love without requiring any sort of qualification. And some people do not even feel that it is a productive or an actual job because of the colonialism in Brazil and other Latin American countries. We know that all of this led to this beginning of this type of work that is being forced. We know that women have always been somehow considered to be part of this type of slavery. And this is a type of things that we have to face. It is there are a lot of situations going on against our history of lack of appreciation, and all of that has consequences on the access that we have on labor rights. And all countries of Latin America have a very similar history when it comes to exploitation. As labor codes started to become enacted for us carers or workers, we know that domestic workers were not included in those laws. The justification was that the work conducted by domestic workers is not productive, it is not profitable. And now, over the past 15 years, we have had all types of processes before left wing governments. We have talked to them so that we're included in this type of labor rights. All of this takes time, and we have always been excluded. We have had a lot of complications in terms of social inequality and lack of access to social security and social protection in general. Who are domestic workers? In Latin America, we're talking about around 18 million domestic workers across 14 to 16% of the female population all over the region, of course, across the different countries of the region. Most of the carers are women, 90% Black women, indigenous or immigrant. In Brazil, domestic work continues to be the main source of income for Black women. In the whole region, over 70 workers are still working informally. Over 70% of the workers are informally working. And we know that usually in our country we have a high rate of this type of informality because we do not have social security. I got this data from ECLAC in 2020. In Brazil, 30% of domestic workers have access to the national social security system. That means that overall, we do have a lot of protection on our day to day. This entails a higher rate of poverty and more vulnerability in terms of social circumstances. This has been generated by the OMS or WHO in 2023. We know that we usually raise these questions. We are at home looking after people, but who is looking after us as well? During the pandemic, this was one of the main challenges that we had to face according to the ILO data. 70% of the workers in the region were impacted on by the crisis. 4 out of 6 lost a lot of jobs, and that led to higher poverty, inequality as well. And with this high rate of informality, And that means that women, millions and millions of Black women, were found in extreme poverty circumstances. So millions of Black women were already poor, we know, but after the pandemic, they fall into this extreme poverty. They did not have access to social security, they were unemployed, and they did not have any other types of social security service in addition to losing their jobs. According to a survey conducted by Fit and Collateral at the time, in 2020, when the pandemic hit, 3% of the domestic workers that were part of the survey, they were dismissed, and 14% lost their jobs and also some working hours. In addition to that, we also had a lack of access to emerging support programs in our governments in countries like Mexico, Chile, or Colombia. Over 70% of people who were the respondents of this survey, they mentioned that they had not received any sort of government aid at all. However, their work was considered key and essential, and it was also considered key and essential. And we still continued to work even if there was a pandemic hitting us, if maybe if even if there was a disease, and even when at the time there were a lot of things that were going on at a country level. And that's how the society realized that our work is really valuable. We know that we're looking after our children, after our elderly. But again, the question again is going to be raised, who is going to look after us? Because we look after everyone. We need to survive and strive in our own realities. And the actions that we needed to take as representatives of that class is that we had virtual and online service for our workers. We had support groups through WhatsApp, online therapy. We had some associations and partnerships with international and national funders and financiers. We had other, uh, we had some campaigns that we conducted in the at the times of the pandemic. Whenever we were just really working with this domestic work, and in addition to community work, and well, we really did not. I mean, we were not really seeking for these public policies to get all of this type of equality as well. And in all countries, we also need to also leave informality as well. We need to improve our labor conditions. We need to get labor contracts as well, decent salaries as well. That's the only way we're going to reach full equality so that we can really ensure decent jobs, access to social security protection, and also minimizing poverty, social discrimination in terms of gender and race. That was just a summary of what we were trying to address here regarding domestic work. 90% are Black women. And what we're trying to decrease is this inequality as part of our domestic work category as well. And again, we had poor Black women, and mainly in Brazil, in other countries, we have immigrants who are leaving their countries. They try out their lucks in other countries, even as social workers. And of course, they even become slaves. Thank you. Thank you so much. Claire has addressed very key topics. I know that she has been also talking about the multiple days of work performed by the carers or domestic workers in addition to their own family work, community work. She also emphasize this deep poverty or extreme poverty that were caused by the pandemic, and that also deepened this situation of injustice related to working conditions of people as well, and also specifically for women that are domestic workers. So the question, who is looking after carers, right? So we need public policies, we need equal rights, and there's also that is to some insights and perspectives that I'm positive that are going to be very important for us to be able to deepen on our way forward. So now let's continue with our second guest, Laura Victoria Gomez Correa, Oxfam Director in Colombia. Thank you. Welcome, Laura. Thank you so much, Carolina. I just want to confirm that you can hear me all right. Right, so I have a big surprise. I have a very special guest. So I'm going to share my topic with Maria Candelaria. She is an Afro-Carthaginian woman as well. So she is also working with Afro-descendant as well. We have organizational topics as well. And this is for us also for us to be able to do that. Currently, Candelaria as well is going to be part of the FUNSAREP as well, an institution that is actively just promoting and defending and advocating for a life free of violence, peace, dignified life, specifically for impoverished communities. She coordinates the women program in FUNSAREP, and her main purpose is to also strengthen life quality. She is a member of this social movement of women in Cartagena. She is currently having a master's degree of University of Cartagena as well. We're going to be talking with her a bit about community work in Colombia. I'm going to share my screen if you don't mind for a minute.
No sé si están viendo mi pantalla en este momento. ¿Sí?
Are you able to see my screen? Yes, perfect. So our presentation is going to be given regarding all of this community care of Afro-descendant populations in Colombia. Community work has allowed us to continue sustaining life, specifically in some territories where we do not have this work. We have some multiple crises going on. So in Colombia, we recognize that community work so we have rural or scattered locations as well. And then we have all of these communities that are mainly consisting of women as well. This is for us to be able to achieve all of this work. So they have done this in situations of precarious conditions that are also just helping us as well to keep us just with these communities. We have a high participation as well. We have Afro-Colombian women, indigenous women, also a lot of farmer women. So we also know that we're incorporating our culture, we're having great conceptions that are in addition to what we call a bon vivre or and all of this is very important as well. All of this has been changing our conceptions on community care, and it helps us also reframe what we understand as care work. We're still discussing, we're still processing everything in Colombia. And currently, we are just designing our care policy, we have a national aspect as well. And we have had an exercise, and we have had organizations, initiatives, or efforts on community care as well to define that concept of care that was adopted in the public policy and how to strengthen those community care policies. We have this community care that has just been established, and that, well, like I mentioned, it is not over yet. It is a process that still continues with a discussion. Community care are those care activities as well that are based on us and our own practices, both in the urban and rural areas that are prioritized. They are conducted as well by people based on the principle of reciprocity, and it is all present in the different territories. They're mainly focusing on community care initiatives that are developing non-compensated activities or symbolically compensated. This is what we're doing with the public policies in Colombia. The mission is quite significant because it has helped us expand care by integrating concepts such as care for the environment, for territory, as part of this public policy and care, by also recognizing this cross dependence, the culture, the territory, and care. And now it's time to pass the floor to Candelaria de Pulveda, with whom we have been developing pilot efforts and initiatives that they are also key for the public arena. So, Candelaria, please. I'll hand over the floor to you. I'm sorry, I was working on making so much, Laura. This means that today we are commemorating just one more year of Black communities of the city of Cartagena, Colombia. And I think that this event is also connected to what we call celebration. I believe that, let's say, this success that we are just really getting from all of these laws recognizing the rights of Afro-descendant population is, of course, also related to our own strives as well. We have a lot of people who are responsible as well. So we know that we have a lot of life conditions that are trying to improve. So it is very important. We're still trying to strive and to fight as feminists as well, and also to recognize my care. So, as Laura was mentioning, from Cartagena, we are also working with this pilot experience as well, with the national government, specifically when it comes to just really improving as well all of our community situation and everything that we see in our territories. We have identified 3 areas in particular where. So we also need to see what are the different situations. How can we characterize all of this? So we also had a change in Juan Angola, Ciénaga de la Virgen, Cerro de la Copa. These are 3 key ecosystems in the city of Cartagena. So these are some sectors that are also just really working uh, power, impoverished neighborhoods, and they have been also racialized, historically speaking, and they have been impoverished, like I mentioned. We have identified our own processes. Laura was also talking about all of this. We know that most carers are women. This is a reality. We still have this type of work. We know that we are at a disadvantage, just like Black women, at the conditions under which all of this is conducted are pretty much precarious. We are just having such a huge workload that are having an impact on our mental health as well. And we're really thinking about our uh, economy in terms of finances, in terms of social development, also for us to continue just contributing in other spheres and domains of the society. So we have identified several strategies to continue working with the different organizations, and they're also aligned with this community plan that we've had. Based on this diagnosis exercise, we have also built this in a participative way. This is based on the different, let's say, topics that we have in the territory, based on the perceptions, on the feelings, and the daily activities that were enriched. And this is how we develop this community plan. Of course, we also have implementation and plans that are intended to strengthen our care actions plans. We have also improved our dignified conditions with our community organizations as well. So with these plans, we have established several strategies. One of them is related to processes. This is for us to be able to strengthen it, of course. We have also used some tools, some implements as well that can help us just really work or develop all of these care activities just by really being very careful because we do not want to just really put a huge workload on people. It's a series of element in the long run, and then also allow that in the short term, then we can also do this exercise. We have some tools that have to do with this administrative, with just developing projects because they are needs that have been just somehow outlined by these organizations because of this need of having certain resources that can improve the conditions under which all of these care actions have been conducted. And the most important part of this exercise is that we really need to create pedagogical or educational spaces, academic spaces, let's call them, so that we can strengthen our construction work and also our care activities and to continue building another culture that can commit to caring. We know that people need to understand that care is a right. So the significance of just really making all of this contribution of this type of community work, because to this point, they were not aware of the fact that with this community service, then we would have a contribution to developing the society and the country. So by creating this community plan just to strengthen the different organizations. All of this, we know that it entails a processes systematization that has allowed to make more evident that we have all of these situations as well, just by taking a look at the different lessons learned. So the last thing that we want to do is to contribute to that national plan, or that is specifically a, what we call the Plancon, which is a care program. We have had great results that are just contributing to all of this. We have lessons learned based on this exercise. And like we said, these lessons learned are not just challenges. We need to keep on working and we need to just really try to understand what is what is community work and this work that is usually conducted by the women leaders as well. We need to continue recognizing our care work and we need to create networks. We need to create social tissue in such an organizative way just for us to be able to have this community care. This is going to allow more impact from this public policies, like our colleague already mentioned, for us to be able to ensure this right to care and being cared for. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for giving us this gift Thank you so much for just having a special guest. We would really like to thank Candelaria. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here. We know that everything that is being conducted in a territory is leading us to a possibility of just really deepening into the knowledge of community care as well. So it does not only integrate our care as well. So we know that in that regard as well, and we know that in Cartagena we're going to have this type of identification as well. And we know that, well, this is a key opportunity as well. This is for us to be able to really have a good recognition of the work conducted by these women that are of a particular race. And as we already heard from Laura at the very beginning, this is work that is not always assessed, valued, or appreciated. And for that reason, it needs to deepen many, many times on these conditions of marginalizations as well, social groups as well. Lastly, we would like to just continue with our third guest, Samuel Samuels, Technical Secretariat of the National Coordination on Black Panamanian Women. Thank you so much. I would like to welcome everyone and thank everyone for being with us. Actually, you have had great presentations, very interesting. I also wanted to contribute to the question and to add up to that question as well. So, we know the UN, we have not been able to really uh, be able to somehow understand how or to help the different cities to have as well so that we can really understand how all of this is going to work. And in that regard, I would just really like to address a different observatory so that we can address all of this through the different as we have really faced the situation as well. I would like to continue with our presentation.
Perfecto. Ok. Se puede ver mi pantalla, correcto, ¿no?
So I think you can see my screen now, right? Yes, sir. All right, thank you. Thank you so much. So these are domestic works that we have been conducted as well in this specific topic. I would like to thank the organization as well, just for having us here. So again, as part of this coordination of Black Panamanian women, according to law, that is establishing a network of Afro-descendants to prevent racism and to also counterattack the poverty. Of course, we're going to apply or enforce this law so as to prevent the national development at an international level as well. So I would like to get into the background. We cannot talk about our reality today if we do not think about this background and races. We know that the very first Black person that came from Panama as well, we had the governor Diego Nicuesa. He came, he founded and established in 1510 and started to have slaves, Black slaves specifically. We were all working in such a way to just really discover the Pacific in 1513. We had Black people who are just being adapted as well. We started again in 1519, just to give you a date. And whenever we start seeing these people who were part of the slavery process, well, we have been on boats, and we were taking votes as well. We know that once you realize that there's a lot of impoverished, just not women, but men as well, they were all part of this enslaved communities. They got deprived of their lands as well. And we also needed to mention all of this. We need to recall the fact that history is not just the present, it also entails the past. So that's the reality of what a lot of things that have been created as well. We know that we had a lot of rebels at the time. We had a lot of people who were just really deprived from their autonomy. So they were enslaved, like we mentioned. We had a lot of jobs, the life of agriculture. Many of them were just used as well for this type of work, construction against their will, of course. And that's something that we need to mention as well. So racism is colonial. We know that slaves were considered slaves. They were not seen as, well, just humans. This is another thing that we need to consider as well. They were also part of the social assets of a person as well. We saw domination that was imposed. We saw a lot of structures that are still prevalent in the contemporary world because we're just connecting all of the dots in a given society. This dichotomy of people who are white, black, and many times we can tell that only certain types of group were just responsible for conducting certain types of jobs. Again, as part of these roles, we also started to find some situations. We knew that not only they were used for this type of jobs, they were also, let's say, like sex machines. Why? Because they were trying to also get slave kids, slave children, and they would even nourish their own children with slave women. So again, think about the marginalization of these Afro-descendant people. Specifically, they were the lowest level of the social levels or classes, to put it that way. Whenever we start just getting into the context as well, in the history and everything, historically speaking, they're a key part to the different resilient communities. So this has had significant impact, culture, economy as well, in the different Afro-descendant communities. We're talking about very specific topics. We have slavery, post-slavery, after emancipation times. In this case, we realized that during the slavery period, Africans in the Americas just conducted a broad range of work. Let's say they were responsible for caring children, caring the elderly, cleaning, and doing many more things. And in other cases, they were very resilient because of their autonomy, because of their own performance. They even had mutual aid support systems, and they created them internally, even at their own levels. Let's talk about the post-emancipation era. We had informal economy after the emancipation of a lot of Afro descendants as well. We have this domestic, uh, as we have. Uh, so we also see the challenge of a lot of women who were also enslaved in this case, more specifically in these areas. And they were even discriminatory because that meant that they were the ones as well who just, well, had all of these restrictions, limitations when they wanted to have access to other types of jobs because they were just restricted to their own types of jobs. They would not have access, let's say, to work in a bank or in a large corporation. So domestic work has got a lot of social and cultural aspects. We have domestic jobs as well, who have historically been associated to Afro descendants. cultural resiliency as well, facing adverse conditions of domestic workers and Afro-descendants who have also just shared their own traditions, labor conditions as well that are compensated lack of safe uh, means for them to be able to have social security. We're still having more equality after time started to go by because more abuse was just being diminished as well or minimized. Again, whenever we think about community support, community care, traditional practices, well, let's take into consideration that Afro descendants are quite united. They like to engage in a lot of actions. They like to highlight their own rights. A lot of countries in the region, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, El Salvador, Mexico, Honduras, we can see how we always have that connectivity with a lot of things that can help us identify our cultural ethnicity. We're always working hand in hand for us to be able to have, let's say, either openness and some sort of exclusion in other topics or systems of the government as well. So social impact that also strengthen different communities. And we have had a lot of community bonds. We have had some sort of consistency, social consistency across the different communities as well. Contemporary trends, well, all of them lead us to think about domestic changes that we have seen. Also, just really making everything more formal, having more recognition. Currently, we have more and more work and efforts put into just making this work more formal. However, just having this effective implementation, even though this is still a challenge in many areas, in Panama, for instance, we were working with this railways. It was very high because we realized that a lot of women died at military bases because they were not properly protected. In some cases, we could even say that, well, in some cases they were well compensated. In some other cases, they were just explored as well. They were exploited. They were just overworked. And again, we just really needed to consider a lot of movements as well. We have, of course, a lot of Afro-descendant communities that were taking part in all of that, like we have already heard from the different colleagues from Colombia and others. We know that at the same time, we have been trying to really eradicate all of these actions. But again, domestic workers, community work as well, they just played a key role in Afro-descendant communities because they were just helping us weave history, resilience as part of our initiatives and efforts that we have tried to just put in place for us to continue just working and growing. So as part of this data that we got from a report that we got from ECLAC, and we already heard our colleague from Colombia talking about this from Latin America, the Caribbean. We have around 14 million people who are domestic workers. 91% of them are women, according to ECLAC again. And most of them are women, girls, in some cases, Afro-descendant adolescents, Afro-Latin, Afro-Caribbean, indigenous, and they're just facing unequal labor conditions, undecent and precarious conditions. There is also racialization in this compensated domestic work. They're facing this type of labor conditions, gender violence, racism, social exclusion, discrimination when performing their jobs. And this has worsened because of this displaced and forced work. Again, ECLAC has already mentioned that in countries like Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Ecuador, Afro-descendant women are the majority who perform this type of compensated domestic work when compared against non-Afro-descendant women. In Ecuador, 1 in 5 women that perform domestic work, compensated work, of course, are Afro-descendant. In Brazil, is 68% of compensated domestic workers. In Uruguay, 72% of Afro-descendant women are devoted to domestic work. And now this precarious situation of labor rights, structural discrimination with the COVID-19 pandemic negatively impacted on the lives of these compensated workers. And because of a lack of social security benefits, and they had a loss from 25 to 3% of their jobs because of this pandemic. But all of this, we had a declaration as well that we got from this action program that was called Urban Plan. So after this World Conference Against Racism in 2001 that was held in Durban, South Africa, they created this comprehensive document and was also trying to propose specific actions to tackle racism, racial discrimination, and we have really moved forward. We have really tried to really continue to work on all of this. But this Afro-descendant population, we're talking about around 200 million people who believe and to identify themselves as Afro-descendants are living in the Americas. Many other millions are living in other parts of the world as well. And we know that their human rights need to be protected and promoted as well. Out of this conference, we start to get this process, which is what we call the 10-year interval for Afro-descendant or the decennial. And what we need to do is to strengthen the regional cooperation as well to foster the full exercise of their cultural, social, economic rights, even if they're Afro-descendant, because they also have been striving to take part in all aspects of society. We identified Afro-descendant women who changed the history of the world. And we're going to see a couple of, let's say, concepts from the north and some other concepts in Mexico, some groups, associations. We have this collective of Afro-Mexican women or Muafro in Costa Chica de Guerrero, Oaxaca. And well, they have also given interviews. We have gotten reports from them, and what they're doing is are just fostering this anti-racial and feministic agenda in each and every one of the countries. We're identifying male and female leaders who are just working and striving to really help women so that children do not continue with this type of ideas. Other women who have also worked worldwide, we have Shirley Chisholm, Serena Williams, Rosa Parks as well, Michelle Obama, Simone Biles, Oprah Winfrey, Mae Jemison, Maya Angelou, Marsha P. Johnson, Kamala Harris as well. He's actually just running for presidential elections, we know. But again, we have still a lot of hope. We have a lot of men and women who are Afro descendants who have put all of their efforts to really minimize this gender gap and and also this racial gap. We know that all these two topics are just overlapping. And again, I just want you to remind you of something that is really good and important. We are not descendant from slaves. We're descending from human beings who were enslaved. This is a quote of Makota Baldina because our black um, family members were enslaved. We were deprived of our rights. So we now need to continue working so that we do not have any sort of racism or discrimination. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you so much, Samuel. It is very important to address various topics, the creation of roles, stereotypes, a deep restriction of labor opportunities. We have also really deepened to this topic of stigmatization as well. We have a lot of aspects as well in the society. And also, we need to strengthen our community service and also the need of just really having these rights, public policies, and for them to be able to be really implemented, put in place for the protection of all of these populations. So I wanted to add a Colombian woman to the list, our Vice President Francia Marquez. Yes, of course. And Hepsi Campbell as well. Of course, absolutely. So thank you so much, Samuel. So now it's time for us to get into a round of Q&A session. First, we have a question for Cleide. The question is as follows. From your experience, What are the actions that states should take to protect and give proper support to our carers? What are the policies or efforts, initiatives that are key to make sure that they get the proper support in terms of labor rights? Jada, the word is yours. States, countries are not really the ones who push forward these initiatives. We know that in order for them to do that, we need organizations and associations pushing forward all of these actions. So we need to really either work with associations, unions, so that all together we can really put pressure on states and countries. Otherwise, if we rely on states only, no one is going to do anything about it. So the first step is to just really start working with the state and with this organization so that we can really enforce all of these rights, the rights of workers. And one of the main approaches and focuses is for us to be able to really start just really working. And we know the ILO needs to really continue ensuring and protecting the rights of domestic workers. That way, first, we need to also start working on our side, and then we need to provoke and cause all of this. We need to force states, countries, for us to be able to really enforce the law. The only way to do so is just by really just doing all of this with a union, with federations, confederations, because no one is going to give us anything really. Not just because they like domestic workers or they feel sympathy for them. No, we need to work, we need to strive ourselves. We, as a group, at least in Brazil and Tragi and some other associations, we are doing a lot of work in that regard. We're working together so that we can just really work as a region. And well, this is the type of action that we need to push forward. That's the only way that I see for us to be able to really have these public policies. And all of that, of course, is going to help us. We need to just pursue it. We need to push it forward. I mean, it has never been easy and it will not be easy. We just need to continue striving. That's the only way to do it, by striving. They're not going to do it for ourselves. That's not the way to do it. We need to go out there and just really start putting pressure and pass all of these public policies. That's the only way. Thank you so much, Clady, for your answer. Now I would like to read another question for Laura Candelaria. How about you give us half and half of the answer, or maybe you can decide who's going to do it? Who or you? What are the next steps for us to continue moving forward to achieve the objectives that we had when it comes to community care, work? So how are we going to plan? Or what is the plan for us to be able to face all of this? Thank you so much, Candelaria. Would you like to answer? Yes, please go ahead. All right. So I think that right now the next step that is very important.
So in the case in which we have to take care of this, because Colombia, what we've achieved is the approval of this instrument. We want it to be implemented. We always face these challenges in correlation to public policy and their enforcement or implementation. Sometimes we don't achieve the approval of these provisions or the norms, but their enforcement or implementation is a major challenge. And the implementation or enforcement of it would turn that policy in the state mandate that's part of the duties of the current administration, but that does have another impact in current administration. So it's implemented in that future. I mean, it's not something that we can just solve. The precarious situation of this field is something that we need to continue progressing on. So and have these long term objectives so we can meet the needs through these initiatives in our territories where there has been a historic absence of the state or government. And another challenge that we've observed is the fact that we've tried to find alternatives to achieve that like autonomy, that autonomy economically of the workers in such a way that it's not burden on women's shoulders or backs. So that's why it's so important for us to continue this development using our creativity to achieve that equality. Thank you so much because thank you for your answer. For people who are not Colombian, UNCOMBIS is an instrument issued by the National Economic Social Policy Council. It's a public policy instrument that's enforced in long term. So, as Laura said, is a policy of state. It's a mandate for government. And what's really awesome is that it guarantees budget allocation. If you have a compass or that instrument, you can allocate budget for that public policy. And just to wrap up, I would like to read the question for Samuel. Samuel, in Panama, which are the actions, immediate actions or policies that are implemented to fight that lack of equality that's faced by Afro-descendant communities? How are you working in that field to ensure like access under the principle of fairness or equality for this segment of the population? Look, what we've done at Panama is that we've started the process, and this process started back in year 2000. We created a program for inclusion. And in that program, we've considered all the gaps or demands. And this program has been developed and analyzed every 5 years. It's submitted to the executive candidates, and we submit this instrument to them for them to execute what the recommendations are. We have progressed in some administration, and in other administrations, some administrations have not considered it relevant. In the past 5 years, I'll tell you that in that 5 year administration, we did progress in the field of the demands of Afro descendants. We did progress at 25%. We were out of that stagnation. Number one, in that administration, in their organic structure, the government and its administration in this country included leaders from Afro-descendant movements and activists. So that turned things to the positive side. So, two, there was an improvement of the quantification or census of the population in 2010. In the 2010 census, the government didn't achieve the measurements for Afro descendants to really answer the questionnaire of the census of the population. Back in 2013 or '03, we worked with other agencies, government stakeholders, international bodies to strengthen the census. So the outputs or the results out of that 9.6% that we obtained in 2010, today, the measurement or quantification of Afro descendants are above the 10% that are acknowledge themselves as Afro descendants. So that speaks in itself. So we're going through the review process of those social movements, working for those who acknowledge their Afro descent. So we want to also generate an impact in the education system where our history is really worded. So in our history books, our kids, our boys, our Afro descendants are part of our history because there's some fear that there's an acknowledgement of Afro descendant activities and achievements. If we reconnect the population to Afro descendants heritage, where we come from, where we're going, if we don't tackle those gaps, we're continuing bullying, exclusion in many of our nations. So there's been a lot of progress. You see my dreadlocks, and I have them on. I would not be capable of holding a position in government with these dreadlocks. But in Panama, I was appointed for my position as an incumbent with my dreadlocks, and we want our kids to be enabled and permitted to go with their dreadlocks, with their curly hair, to schools, to work, everywhere with their hair. And as I've always said, they must feel accepted. It's dignified. You might well you must respect my rights and accept me just because of the way I look, and I can say that. And we've created a ministry, the National Ministry for Afro-Panamanian Policies, Afro-Panamanian policies for those who are working. And there's a specific types in our law that protects Afro-descendants at a national scale. And at a local level of government, we have constituted first government agency for different ethnic descents or breeds that's materialized. It's been constituted in Medellin, and then we copied that model to transfer that for the mayorships in the city of Panama. That's a lot of progress. That had not happened before. And these are government agencies that could fight for the policies and for our people. If governments should make it sustainable and respect the progress that's material now. And that's what we have to work on and fighting for. They should not eradicate or eliminate this progress. Many in administration assume their terms and their positions, and then other administrations say that they don't have enough budget and they eliminate the constituted government agencies or bodies, like what happened in Honduras. They had constituted this body in Honduras by Mr. Leo, and he passed away, and they eliminated that government agency. But the countries sign off treaties and conventions, and then they have a mandate. They create their executive reports in which we understand what's happening, and things have to be squared off. We have certain demands, and some government agencies create an executive report that only mirrors a segment of reality, and it doesn't mirror the real conditions of our population. I know that some might fear the constant progress, that constant development of these efforts, and we're expecting with this new administration the respect of the project, the development, and these programs which are including with resiliency. Well, thank you so much, Samuel. And we'd like to thank all the panel members. Truth of the matter is that it's been very important for us to listen to all your feedback, your observations, all your contributions, because you open room for dialogue for this debate. You're inviting others to maintain and preserve the drafted public policies, and you're opening these panels for debate in which we can all share and contribute in our Latin American economies and nations, and we share our experiences, and it's very important, and it will well it's an effort. It's very robust, it's enriching, and it's been an honor for me to have moderated this panel. And once we finished, the floor is open for Brandon, who now will make a final announcements to celebrate the closure of this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thanks, Carolina, and we thank all the panel members. I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you for contributing. I've already expressed my comments at the beginning, but being regulated, not regulated, domestic workers, independent job opportunities, these dialogues will continue next week in the Communities Forum for Latin American Governments and Economies. And that next week's forum, we're going to continue this debate with Clay. For Clay, we're inviting member states to ratify the 189 Convention and implement it or enforce it. We're going to have some dialogues with these countries that have already enforced this law or conventions, and we want to ask and stimulate other economies to continue enforcing these treaties and conventions. Thank you to the moderator. We thank the moderator and the panel members. And on behalf of the General Secretary, Mr. Velarca invites you to follow the sequence of panels that are scheduled for tomorrow's conference. We're going to have the participation of the first Afro-descendant Senator, Ms. Sanchez Sucia. We have a healthcare panel, thanks to PAHO. And then we're going to invite another panel that's pro-feminism with Ms. Benitez Mendoza. She's an activist that's knowledgeable about these subjects. And before I announce the closure of this panel, I wanted my colleague, Mr. Vic, to be present before you at the streaming. He contacted you and sent you the invites to join us. But I'd like to express my thankfulness because Vilchis has helped me organize a sequence of panels. And I'd like to thank the executive unit of the member states of the Inter-American Conference that's always helping us out to coordinate this event, the technical support team, and the rest of the stakeholders involved. Thank you very much. A round of applause for all of you. And we hope We hope that you can join this streaming tomorrow, access the same link, and thank you all once again. Carolina, Laura, Samuel, thank you all so much. Candelaria, thanks for being here. Thank you, Dr. Monsalve. I hope you're doing great. Thank you.